Every creature carries a quiet detail inside it, something small and true that most trainers pass by without stopping to notice. There are 966 Pokémon in the world as it stands today, and each one holds something worth knowing, a fact that rests just beneath the surface, patient and still, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to find it. Before we drift any deeper into these quiet corners, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. The world of Pokémon is enormous and unhurried, and so are we, moving through it now, one creature at a time, beginning where it all began. Bulbasaur was the very first Pokémon ever listed in the National Pokédex, carrying the number 1 beside its name, as if the entire world had agreed to start here with this small seed-bearing creature and its patient, leafy back. It was not the most popular choice, nor always the first picked, but it was the beginning. And there is something gently significant about that. Bulbasaur's Pokédex entry describes a seed growing on its back from the moment it is born, a seed that the creature has never once separated from across its entire life. The bond between Bulbasaur and the plant that rests on it is not a choice, but a constant, something rooted and permanent from the very first breath. In the earliest generations, Bulbasaur learned Leech Seed at level 7, one of its first true expressions of what it was. That move was altered in Pokémon Sun and Moon, shifted out in favor of Vine Whip, before being quietly restored again in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. The change and the return both happened without ceremony, the way small corrections often do. Bulbasaur is the only starter Pokémon whose final evolution, Venusaur, belongs to 2 types from the very beginning of its line. Grass and poison have always been present in Bulbasaur, without change, without shift. Other starters gain a secondary type through evolution, but Bulbasaur carries both from the start, which makes it unusual in a line of creatures already known for being unusual. Venusaur's design is considered one of the more complex among the original Pokémon, enough so that the artist Atsuko Nishida, who worked on the series in its early years, found it particularly demanding to draw. The layering of the flower, the broad-spotted body, and the textured skin combine in ways that require careful attention to reproduce accurately. It is a design that rewards patience, which feels right for a Pokémon whose nature was always quiet and steady. Ivysaur carries a gentler presence, the middle stage of a line that moves from small and curious to broad and ancient. Its bud has not yet bloomed, and something about that holds a kind of softness. It is a creature in the middle of becoming, not yet arrived, not anymore a beginning. There was a period in Pokémon Black and White when Ivysaur could not be traded over the G2S if it carried its original English name. The word censors built into those games read something in the name that triggered a filter, and so for a time, Ivysaur existed in a kind of quiet limbo, unable to pass between trainers across the network. The rule was never about the Pokémon itself, only the letters, which is a strange and small kind of story. Charmander stood at the other end of the starter selection, a lizard with a flame at the tip of its tail that Pokédex entries say will go out if the flame is ever extinguished. That detail has been with Charmander since the beginning, a small myth attached to it the way the seed is attached to Bulbasaur, inseparable from what it is. Niue, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean, once released a commemorative coin bearing Charmander's image, a legal tender $1 piece from a sovereign nation carrying a cartoon lizard on its face. The coin was real and spendable. Somewhere in the world, Charmander became currency, which is not a fact that fades easily from the mind. Charmeleon and Kilava share the exact same base stat total and the same stat distribution across every individual number. They are entirely different creatures from different regions, different designs, different inspirations, and yet the numbers that define how they perform in battle are perfectly matched. The Charmeleon line and the Quilava line mirror each other this way across all three stages, a symmetry that was either deliberate or extraordinary. Charizard in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet cannot learn Metal Claw or False Swipe through the TM system, despite the fact that its pre-evolution Charmander can learn Metal Claw through Level Up, and that False Swipe is available to it via TM at earlier stages. The move pool narrows rather than broadens, which is unusual for a final evolution, and it creates a small absence that sits quietly in Charizard's otherwise extensive list of available moves. Squirtle is categorized in the Pokédex as the tiny turtle Pokémon. Wartortle, its evolution, becomes simply the turtle Pokémon. And then Blastoise, the large and powerful final form, is listed not as the giant turtle Pokémon, which would feel natural, but as the shellfish Pokémon, a category it shares with Kabuto and Kabutops, two ancient fossil creatures from a different era entirely. The naming feels like a small puzzle, a connection between creatures that may or may not be intentional. In the original Pokémon Adventures manga, the character known as Green in Japan, or Blue in the Western releases, did not receive her Squirtle from a professor or a lab. She stole it from Professor Oak. Her Squirtle became Blasty, a name she chose herself, and the relationship between trainer and Pokémon began not in gift, but in taking, which gave the character a particular kind of sharpness that the games never quite replicated. Wartortle has white ears and a white tail, both fluffy and rounded. In early promotional art, drawn before the anime's official release, those ears were shown in the same color as its face rather than white. The difference was small but noticeable, and the final design settled on the white that has defined Wartortle ever since. That early version lingers only in the promotional art, a ghost of a slightly different turtle. Caterpie was the first Pokémon ever caught in the Pokémon anime, pulled from the tall grass in the very first episode of the series. It was also the first Pokémon ever seen evolving in the anime, the first creature to visibly change into something new before the audience's eyes. Two firsts for one small bug, which says something about how the series chose to begin its storytelling. Metapod, similarly, holds a distinction in the realm of film. It was the first Pokémon ever seen evolving in a Pokémon movie, a moment that carried its own kind of weight, even for a creature that spends most of its time in stillness, wrapped in a hard green shell, simply waiting to become something else. Butterfree is classified as a bug-type Pokémon and has been since its introduction in the first generation of games. And yet, for the first two generations, Butterfree could not learn a single bug-type move. The creature that embodied the category had no access to the category's moves for years. The third generation corrected this, giving Butterfree finally the ability to use moves that matched what it was supposed to be. Weedle is, in a quiet sense, one of the most limited Pokémon in the mainline games. It cannot learn any normal-type moves whatsoever. Its entire learnable move, set in the main series games, consists of only 3 moves: Poison Sting, String Shot, and Bug Bite. 3 moves across an entire life. There is something almost meditative about that smallness, a creature that exists within very precise boundaries and does not seem to mind. Beedrill's English name was originally spelled with only one L, a detail from the earliest releases of the games that was corrected before most players ever noticed it. Its Japanese name translates simply to spear, direct and plain, which suits a creature built around sharp points. Kakuna, in its Pokémon Red and Blue sprite, appears to have arms visible beneath its shell, as if something is pressing outward, testing the edges. Later, sprites remove this detail entirely. But in one piece of early concept art, those arms appear again, which suggests they were part of the original vision before being smoothed away in later designs. Pidgey has the shortest cry of any Pokémon in the series. At just over 1800ths of a second, its call is brief enough to be missed entirely if you are not listening. A sound barely longer than a blink, which feels right for a small brown bird that has always been easy to overlook. Pidgeotto's Pokédex entries in several games describe it as a creature that will fiercely peck at any intruder that comes near its territory. And yet, Pidgeotto cannot learn the move peck. The behavior described in the lore exists only in the lore, with no mechanical expression inside the games themselves. It is a small gap between story and system, the kind that fills the games quietly. Rattata holds an unusual distinction in the Pokémon Rumble game released for the Wii. In that game, the very first Pokémon a player ever uses is a Rattata, which technically makes it the starter Pokémon of that title. It is a starter Pokémon in the loosest possible sense, but the designation belongs to it, and Rattata has never seemed like the type to turn it away. Spearow is commonly assumed to be based on a sparrow, given the closeness of the name and the small brown appearance. But the inspiration is actually a shrike, a bird that hunts prey larger than itself and pins food to thorns for storage. The shrike is more capable and more aggressive than the sparrow, and knowing that shifts the way Spearow reads gives it a little more edge beneath the ordinary feathers. Fiaro carries a red marking on the top of its head called a coxcomb, a term shared with the same structure on domestic chickens. The name crosses species, and it crosses into the world of Pokémon, landing on a bird that circles high above open roots with a sharp eye and a longer memory than it appears to have. Arbok's chest marking changes slightly between certain games. Comparing the Pokémon Emerald sprite with the Fire Red and Leaf Green sprite shows a clear difference in the pattern, which has led some to wonder whether the changing pattern, described in some Pokédex entries as capable of terrifying enemies, was meant to vary intentionally between versions, or whether the difference was simply an inconsistency that was never corrected. Pikachu is the only Pokémon that was available in all three Pokémon pinball games: the original Game Boy release, the Ruby and Sapphire Game Boy Advance game, and Pokémon Pinball Mini for the Pokémon Mini system. 3 pinball games across 3 generations of hardware, and Pikachu was present in all of them, a constant small yellow shape bouncing between bumpers. Raichu's Pokédex entry in Pokémon Fire Red and Pokémon Sun describes its electricity as powerful enough to knock out an Indian elephant. By the time of Pokémon Legends Arceus, that comparison had been changed. The Indian elephant was replaced by a copper jaw, a creature from within the Pokémon world, rather than a reference to the real world. The shift was quiet and small, but it moved Raichu's story further inward, into a world that stands apart from our own. The Nidoran line holds a distinction that most Pokémon lines do not. Nidoran female and Nidoran male were the first Pokémon in the series to feature a gender difference as part of their design, not just different genders sharing a single entry, but 2 entirely separate Pokédex entries for 2 creatures that are considered distinct Pokémon in their own right. Later, gender differences, such as those on Meowstic, would appear under a single entry. The Nidoran pair were treated differently, their distinction treated as something closer to species than variation. Nidorina and Nidoqueen carry a peculiarity shared by no other Pokémon in the series. Both are in the undiscovered egg group, meaning neither can produce eggs despite being adult female creatures. Their pre-evolution, Nidoran female, can breed without any issue. The restriction seems to sit in the middle of a line where reproduction is otherwise possible, as if something in the evolution itself removed that ability. In the original Japanese red and green versions, Nidoqueen's weight was listed as 6 kilograms rather than 60. At the time, weight had no effect on battles or any in-game mechanics, so the error changed nothing about how the game played. But the number sat wrong in the data, an extra zero missing from a large and powerful creature, a quiet mistake that was eventually corrected. Clefairy was originally intended to be the mascot of the Pokémon franchise. The round pink creature with small wings and a star-shaped tail was the leading choice before Pikachu took that position. Clefairy still appeared prominently in early promotional material, and in the original manga, the protagonist's partner was indeed a Clefairy rather than a Pikachu. The world almost went a different direction, and Clefairy held that near center for a while before the yellow took over. Jigglypuff's song, as described in the Pokédex, causes any creature that hears it to fall asleep, regardless of how hard they try to stay awake. The song adjusts in length and rhythm to keep the listener on the edge of sleep for as long as possible. What the Pokédex does not always mention is that Jigglypuff itself falls asleep if it runs out of air while singing, making its own melody dangerous to sustain for too long. Wigglytuff's Pokédex entries describe its body as capable of inflating to many times its normal size. The body is said to be so elastic and smooth that touching it brings an involuntary sense of comfort. The skin is described in some entries as the softest material in the world, a superlative that sits quietly alongside the creature's round pink form and wide, unblinking eyes. Zubat has no eyes. Its Pokédex entries note that it has evolved past the need for vision, navigating entirely through ultrasonic waves that it emits from its mouth. Yet the game applies accuracy penalties to Zubat when it uses certain moves, as if the mechanics have not quite caught up with the lore. The eyeless Pokémon that should see everything through sound is sometimes described as missing. Golbat's tongue is described as so long it can wrap around its own body, and its bite strong enough to drain half a liter of blood in a very short time. The Pokédex entries dealing with Golbat are among the more quietly unsettling in the series, which is perhaps why Golbat has always felt slightly apart from the cave passages it haunts, a creature that fits its environment almost too well. Oddish is described in the Pokédex as wandering through open fields at night, sowing seeds wherever it walks. During the day, it buries itself in the ground with only its leaf-covered head exposed, absorbing nutrients from the soil. The cycle of night walking and daytime stillness gives Oddish a rhythm that mirrors something close to sleep itself, a small vegetable creature at peace with the dark and the quiet. Gloom's Pokédex entries note that the honey it drips from its mouth is extremely sweet, despite the overwhelming smell that accompanies it. The smell is described as so powerful it can cause fainting at a range of several miles. Yet insects apparently find the scent attractive rather than repellent, drawn toward the very thing that drives most other creatures away. Vileplume has the largest petals of any flower in the Pokémon world, according to its Pokédex entries. The petals are described as so heavy that the creature staggers when it walks. Pollen releases from the petals constantly, spreading in a fine toxic cloud that drifts wherever Vileplume goes, which is somewhere between being a garden and being a slow disaster. Paras carries mushrooms on its back called Tochocaso, and the Pokédex entries for later stages of its line suggest that it is the mushrooms that grow on its back that are actually in control of the creature's behavior, using it as a host to spread and flourish. Parasect, the evolved form, has eyes that have gone fully white, drained of any independent expression, and the mushroom on its back has grown to eclipse its head entirely. It is one of the quieter and stranger stories in the original games. Venonat's large red eyes are noted in some Pokédex entries to be capable of seeing in total darkness, detecting the heat of other creatures, and functioning as a kind of natural searchlight. Its entire body is described as covered in fine venomous hairs that sting anything that touches them. Venomoth, which it evolves into, has those same traits softened, given wings, and a new way of moving through the dark air. Diglett's appearance below the ground has never been fully shown in the main series games. What exists beneath the soil is one of the older running questions in the Pokémon fan community. The games have occasionally teased answers without fully committing to one, and so Diglett remains a small brown tube above the surface, holding its secret underground, which is its own kind of comfortable mystery. Dugtrio moves through the earth at a speed the Pokédex describes as capable of reaching nearly 60 miles per hour underground. The vibration created by their tunneling can cause small earthquakes in the areas above them. 3 identical heads sharing whatever lies beneath them, moving through the dark earth in perfect coordination. Meowth is one of a small number of Pokémon capable of human speech in the anime, a trait that the anime explains through years of effort and the motivation to impress a Meowth that had been raised among humans. The learning of language by Meowth is treated in the anime as a sacrifice of battle ability, as if the mind had traded one capacity for another. Persian's Pokédex entries note that the gem embedded in its forehead is a sign of elegance and status, and that the gem glows when Persian is angry. In Alola, the regional variant of Persian has a rounder, flatter face, and some Pokédex entries for that variant mention that the round face is considered beautiful in the Alolan aesthetic, while the standard form's angular features are considered refined elsewhere. Beauty changes with location, and Persian adapts to the idea even in its description. Psyduck walks around in a permanent state of headache, so severe it can barely function. The pain, however, is what triggers its psychic abilities, making suffering the cost of power. When the headache reaches its peak, Psyduck can unleash abilities far beyond what its calm state allows. It is a creature whose best moments emerge from its worst ones. Golduck's Pokédex entries describe it as one of the fastest swimming Pokémon, capable of outpacing any boat in the water. The gem on its forehead glows when it uses its powers, a signal visible from a distance, a blue light moving through dark water. There is something calm and far away about that image, a creature gliding through depth, its forehead lit up like something beneath the surface of the sea, choosing to be seen. Mankey is described in the Pokédex as having almost no patience. At the slightest provocation, it erupts into a fury that its entries say can last long after the cause has been forgotten. There is something both understandable and sad about that. A creature that feels things so intensely it cannot release them, anger that has outlasted its reason. Primeape has a Pokédex entry, specifically an older one from the first generation, noting that it sometimes becomes so angry it dies. That entry influenced, at least in spirit, the concept behind Annihilop, a later evolution of Primeape introduced in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. Annihilate is the rage that could not stop, the fury that crossed into something beyond life, which makes the connection between that ancient Pokédex entry and this newer Pokémon feel like a thread that was always there, waiting to be followed. Growlithe is one of the Pokémon that the series has associated most consistently with loyalty. Its entries describe it as a creature that will defend its territory with extraordinary courage, and that will never abandon someone it has chosen to protect. Police in the anime use Growlithe for that quality, trusting the creature's instinct to protect and follow. Arcanine carries the title of the legendary Pokémon in its category, a designation shared by no other non-legendary Pokémon in the original games. The name was apparently given before the final classification of the games was settled, leaving Arcanine with a title that sounds larger than its official standing, a legend that never quite became one in the game's structure. Poliwag's spiral marking, visible on its body, is actually the intestines visible through the thin skin of its belly. The Pokédex is direct about this. The spiral is not a pattern applied to the surface, but something internal made visible by how thin the skin is. Poliwrath, its fully evolved fighting form, retains the spiral, but the skin has thickened enough that the meaning has faded into decoration. Abra can only learn a single move through leveling up in the original games, which is Teleport. It uses that move to escape from battle before any other action occurs, which makes catching one without a Master Ball or significant preparation a genuine puzzle. The creature sleeps 18 hours a day, teleporting away even in its sleep if it senses danger, which means catching an Abra requires finding the exact fraction of time when it is present enough to be caught. Kadabra was the subject of a legal dispute when a professional illusionist claimed the character was based on him without permission, citing the spoon, the psychic framing, and the character's name in different languages. The dispute led to Kadabra being absent from the trading card game for several years, a gap that was eventually closed after the legal issue resolved. The spoons remained. Machamp can throw 500 punches per second, according to certain Pokédex entries, each punch powerful enough to send an opponent flying far beyond sight. Its 4 arms move independently and in coordination, which gives it the ability to attack in ways that a 2-armed opponent cannot easily predict or counter. Machamp ties its own belt as a measure to restrain itself, and the Pokédex notes that without the belt, its power becomes too difficult to manage. Bellsprout's body is described as so flexible it can bend without breaking in almost any direction, twisting to follow prey or to avoid incoming attacks. The stem is said to be stronger than it appears, capable of winding around a foe and holding on with surprising force. Something so thin and delicate containing that kind of persistence. Weepinbell is described in some entries as capable of digesting almost anything that falls into the inside of its bell-shaped body. The Pokédex notes that it occasionally mistakes sleeping creatures nearby for prey, folding around them before they can respond. The lids of forests in the Pokémon world have a quiet danger to them, a kind of camouflage that asks everything beneath it to pay attention. Victreebel's Pokédex entry from the original games describes the interior of its body as being filled with acid so powerful it dissolves anything it contacts nearly instantly. The Pokémon lures prey with a sweet smell, then closes around them. In the anime, the vine-shaped opening of Victreebel was repeatedly used as a running joke, swallowing James of Team Rocket in greetings that felt more like ambushes. The comedy lived comfortably beside the genuinely unsettling description. Tentacool is listed in certain games as one of the most commonly encountered water types in the ocean, present in such quantities that it has been compared to something like a swarm beneath the surface. Tentacruel, its evolved form, has been known to appear in the anime as a massive individual capable of affecting large coastal areas. The ordinary and the enormous share a line, which is unusual even for a series comfortable with unusual things. Geodude was once described in one Pokémon game's promotional material as so common that people trip over them during mountain hikes without realizing what they stepped on. The creature blends so completely into rocky terrain that the distinction between Geodude and the surrounding landscape is sometimes only visible when one of them moves. Graveler is described in certain entries as rolling down mountain slopes at high speed, crashing into and through anything in its path without concern or ability to stop. The momentum carries it far past intention. Golem, the final evolution, is said to shed its outer shell every year, the rock exterior replaced by a new layer, the old one left behind somewhere, a hollow sphere that was once the creature's skin. Ponyta's flames are described at birth as being very weak, barely visible above the mane, and growing stronger as the Pokémon matures and becomes more confident in its running. The foal is born small and unsteady, the fire low, and the hooves soft enough that they haven't yet hardened to withstand the gallop. Over time, both the fire and the hooves become what they need to be, a progression that happens quietly, as growth often does. Rapidash can reach a full gallop from a standing start in 10 steps, according to its Pokédex entries. At full speed, the fire of its mane streams backward in a shape like wings, which gives the impression of flight, even when all four hooves are still meeting the ground. Rapid things often look like they are doing something other than what they are doing. Slowpoke takes approximately 5 seconds to feel pain after being injured, the signal traveling so slowly through its body that the response comes long after the event. It fishes by dangling its tail into the water, often not noticing when something bites until minutes later. The calm it carries is not chosen tranquility, but structural delay, a creature that lives a few seconds behind its own experience. Slowbro came about when a Shelder latched onto a Slowpoke's tail, and both creatures evolved together. A paired evolution where one creature's change depends entirely on another creature's attachment. The Shelder's bite is said to keep Slowpoke in a permanent state of happiness, and the Shelder itself evolves into a shape entirely unlike its usual form. Two creatures, neither quite itself anymore, both changed by the connection. Magnemite was one of the earliest Steel-type Pokémon in concept, though the Steel-type itself didn't exist in the first generation. Magnemite was reclassified as Electric and Steel in the second generation, gaining a type it had not been born with, the same creature given new definition by a rule that did not exist when it first appeared. Haunter was the Pokémon that Ash's friend Sabrina famously received in the anime, used to make the emotionally withdrawn gym leader laugh for the first time in years. The gesture worked not through battle, but through performance, through the irreducible silliness of a ghost-type making faces. The episode is remembered as one of the kinder ones, a resolution that didn't require anyone to defeat anyone. Gengar is described in the Pokédex as the shadow of Clefable, one lurking where the other walks, the two sharing enough silhouette that one theory holds them to be opposites transformed. The relationship is never confirmed in the games as anything more than a coincidence of shape, but the shadow follows Clefable through enough descriptions that the idea has settled into the fan understanding of both Pokémon as something near to fact. Onix is one of the largest Pokémon in the original games, stretching to a height that no other creature in the first generation approaches. Its body is composed of connected boulders that grind against each other as it moves, polished smooth by years of underground travel. As Onix ages, its body becomes smoother and rounder, the edges worn away by the earth around it, until the creature and the stone it travels through become harder to tell apart. Drowsy was inspired by a creature from Japanese folklore called the Baku, a being described as a dream eater, a creature that consumes nightmares when summoned by someone in distress. The Pokédex entries for Drowsy lean into this, describing it as fond of eating pleasant dreams and less interested in unpleasant ones, a reversal of the Baku's traditional purpose that gives Drowsy a slightly more selfish character than its inspiration. Hypno carries a pendulum that it swings to hypnotize those who meet its eyes. Its Pokédex entry in some games warns that it should not be left alone near children, a sentence that arrives with a weight the game leaves quietly in place, without elaboration. Hypno is otherwise described as a peaceful and somewhat solitary creature, but the warning has stayed in the text through multiple games. A small dark note at the edge of its description sheets, Krabby is found on beaches, described as so small when first hatched that it must hide under rocks or inside empty shells. Despite its size, it is aggressively territorial, attacking anything that enters its space with claws disproportionately large for its body. The Pokédex notes that the claws are so heavy relative to the rest of Krabby's body that if it loses one in battle, it becomes temporarily unable to maintain balance. Kingler can crush a crab shell with the force of its claws, a Pokédex claim that places it among the physically strongest grip-based Pokémon in the original games. The larger of its two claws is powerful enough to be impractical, too heavy to swing quickly, and difficult to aim with precision. Strength that outgrows the ability to use it is a particular kind of limitation. Electrode has the highest base speed stat of any electric-type Pokémon in the original games. It is described as self-destructing out of boredom or agitation, sometimes for no clear reason at all. Power plants in the Pokémon world apparently must monitor for rogue electrodes that have wandered in and may detonate without warning, which is the kind of occupational hazard that doesn't appear in many other fictional worlds. Exeggutor in its standard form is described as being made of heads that have fallen and rolled away from the tree, each developing an independent mind while still cooperating with the others. In its Alolan form, Exeggutor grows to an extraordinary height, tall enough that the Pokédex describes its head as being so far away from the rest of the body that they have essentially lost contact. The Alolan form is the tallest grass-type Pokémon in the series, and its neck was specifically cited by the game's director as being that tall simply because it could be. Cubone is one of the Pokémon whose backstory has generated the most quiet sadness in the community. It wears the skull of its deceased mother and cries for her at night, the hollow of the skull amplifying the sound until the cry echoes across the surrounding area. The bones it carries are hers, and the only image the community has of who Cubone's mother was comes from a single scene in the original games, where something that looks like a Kangaskhan without its pouch is implied to be what Cubone came from. Marowak in the Lavender Town sequence of the original games exists as a ghost, blocking access in the Pokémon Tower above its resting place, protecting the space where it fell. It cannot be caught, only allowed to rest after an encounter with the Sylph Scope, which reveals what is actually there. It is the clearest ghost story in the original games, and it belongs to Marowak entirely. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan were named in the English releases after Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, respectively. In the original Japanese, their names derive from different sources. The naming in English grounded them in a specific cultural moment in Western martial arts cinema that the original names did not carry. Lickitung's tongue is twice the length of its body, according to its Pokédex entries. The tongue is described as flexible enough to wrap around almost anything and coated in a saliva so thick it causes a numbing sensation on contact. It uses the tongue primarily to examine its surroundings, tasting and feeling things, before committing to touching them directly, a creature that knows its own world through a very specific kind of contact. Coughing and wheezing were almost named Ni and La in the original English localization, references to the cities of New York and Los Angeles, two places associated with smog and air quality issues. The names were changed before the final release, but the connection between the Pokémon's design and pollution imagery remained woven into their appearance and Pokédex entries, regardless of what they were called. Rhyhorn charges in a straight line and cannot adjust its direction mid-charge. Its Pokédex notes that its memory is so short, it often forgets what it was charging at before it arrives at the destination. The momentum is real, but the purpose dissolves. Raiden, its evolution, is noted in some sources as one of the very first Pokémon ever designed, a rough early shape from which many others followed, a beginning dressed up in gray horn and powerful legs. Chansey is one of the rarest Pokémon in the original games, encountered so infrequently in the Safari Zone that many players completed the games without ever seeing one. It carries an egg at all times, and its entries describe it as a creature that will share that egg with anyone who is hungry or hurt, the gesture offered without hesitation. It is one of the kinder creatures in the Pokédex, defined by generosity in every entry. Tangela's body is completely hidden under a mass of blue vines, and no image of what lies beneath has ever been officially shown. Even the Pokédex does not describe what the creature looks like under the vines. Like Diglett below the ground, Tangela keeps its interior to itself, which makes it one of the quieter mysteries in the older generation. Kangaskhan carries its young in a pouch, and its Pokédex entries describe a mother so protective that it will fight opponents many times its own size to defend the child resting there. The parent always fights with its young watching from inside the pouch, a design detail that gives every Kangaskhan battle a strange kind of weight. A Mega Evolution form, released in a later generation, allows the child to leave the pouch during battle and fight alongside the parent, the two connected by something the mechanic makes visible for the first time. Horsea spits ink as a defensive measure, clouding the water around it to obscure its location from predators. Seadra, its evolution, is described as possessing sharp spines that cause intense pain on contact, and whose movements through the water are swift enough that larger Pokémon give it space. Despite the danger, Seadra is described as a devoted parent, the male cradling eggs against its stomach the way seahorses do in the actual world. Goldeen is called the water flower Pokémon, and its Pokédex entries describe it as being graceful when swimming in calm water and dangerous when its horn is involved. In the anime, Goldeen appeared memorably in the episode where Misty released a Pokémon from a Pokéball inside a gym, only to find a flopping fish incapable of battle on land. The Goldeen just flopped. The joke landed because the Pokémon was completely itself. Seeking is noted in some Pokédex entries as drilling into streambeds with its horn to lay eggs, the horn powerful enough to bore through rock. The eggs are then guarded by both parents simultaneously, one of the few references in the original games to shared parenting behavior among Pokémon. The stream flows over the nest, and the parents remain, the water carrying whatever the water carries, while the eggs remain in the stone below. Staryu and Starmie are among the Pokémon whose origins feel most deliberately alien. Starmie's Pokédex entry suggests it may have come from outer space, with the gem at its center believed to be a transmission device sending signals of unknown content. What it is sending, to whom, and whether anything has ever responded are questions the games leave entirely open. Scyther's blades are described as sharp enough to slice through thick logs in a single stroke. The cut so clean, it leaves a surface smooth enough to reflect. The creature moves at high speed, which the Pokédex says makes its slashes nearly invisible in motion. The visual of Scyther at full speed, blades moving faster than sight, is one of the more striking in the original game's design language, a creature built entirely around one elegant and violent capability. Pinsir is described as gripping opponents between its large horns and squeezing with enough force to split rock. It sleeps in trees during cold weather, the body temperature dropping until it becomes nearly motionless. The lore around Pinsir has always been slightly brutal, a creature defined by grips and force rather than grace, which stands apart from some of the other bug types that emphasize transformation or flight. Tauros is described as one of the most aggressive Pokémon in the original games, charging at anything in its territory without provocation and whipping itself into a greater frenzy with its own tails. In the anime, Ash caught multiple Taros in the Safari Zone during a series of scenes that were edited out of the Western broadcast, meaning many international viewers had no explanation for where the herd of Tauros in Ash's collection had come from. They appeared without preamble, a small mystery created by censorship. Magikarp is one of the more deliberately weak Pokémon in the series, capable of learning only Splash in its earliest levels, a move that does nothing at all. The Pokédex enters into a conversation with its own design here, describing Magikarp as practically useless in battle, while also noting that it swam the seas of the ancient world in enormous numbers. Something about its survival speaks to a strategy invisible at the surface, endurance as a method, weakness as a kind of waiting. Gyarados is what Magikarp becomes after reaching level 20, and the transformation is one of the most celebrated in the series. The serpentine shape, the deep blue scales, the enormous scale are nothing like the small, flopping fish it came from. Its Pokédex entries note that Gyarados has been known to rage for months, burning entire cities in a fury that only subsides when it chooses to stop. The patience of Magikarp and the fury of Gyarados share a line, connected by the same creature at different moments of its life. Lapras is described as a gentle Pokémon that carries people across the water on its back, understanding human speech and using its songs to communicate with others of its kind. Its Pokédex entries in several games note that Lapras were hunted nearly to extinction and that their numbers have not yet recovered. The gentle creature with the songs is also the one whose story carries the heaviest kind of loss within the original Pokédex, a creature that endured something the world allowed to happen. Ditto can transform into any Pokémon it encounters, replicating appearance and abilities, if not always the fine details of stat distribution. The one element it cannot perfectly replicate is another Ditto, a limitation the games acknowledge. When two Dittos meet, neither can become the other convincingly, which is a strange loop, the creature defined by imitation encountering the one thing it cannot quite mirror. Eevee has more branching evolutions than any other Pokémon in the series, with 8 different final forms, depending on the conditions applied during evolution. Each form requires something different: a specific stone, a particular location, a high enough friendship combined with the right time of day, exposure to a specific move type. The possibilities branch out from a single small, fox-shaped creature whose potential is almost entirely determined by the world around it and the choices made on its behalf. Vaporeon, one of Eevee's water-type evolutions, can dissolve its body into water, becoming effectively invisible in liquid. The Pokédex describes it as vanishing into the water and becoming undetectable, a creature that can choose to stop being visible, the body that is mostly water entering the thing it mostly is. Jolteon's cells produce electricity as it moves, each step generating a small charge that accumulates until it can release a bolt at significant power. Its fur is described as sharp-pointed enough to function as needles, each strand capable of delivering a static discharge to anything that touches it. The outside of Jolteon is a warning, and the inside carries the energy that makes the warning real. Flareon stores fire in an internal flame sac, which can be fanned to reach temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Celsius, according to certain Pokédex entries. It releases the heat through the fur that puffs around its body, the temperature rising and visible even without direct contact. The warmth it gives off is a byproduct of what it contains. Porygon was the first Pokémon to be described as fully artificial, created through programming rather than through any biological process. It can travel through cyberspace and is described as capable of moving through anything connected to the digital world. In the anime, an episode featuring Porygon used flashing visuals that resulted in seizures for a number of viewers, and the episode was removed from circulation. Porygon was never featured prominently in the anime again, despite having no responsibility for the technical choices that caused the incident. Its evolutions, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, also avoided the anime, collateral shadows of something that was not their fault. Omanite and Kabuto are restored from fossils in the original games, creatures brought back from extinction through scientific process described within the game's world. What the games do not address is whether the creature restored is the same individual whose fossil was used, or something new made from ancient material. The question of identity and resurrection is one the games leave open, which may be the kindest way to leave it. Aerodactyl is described as the fastest Pokémon of its era, a prehistoric creature that the Pokédex says may have been the apex predator of its time. Restored from Old Amber, it is a creature dislocated from its own age, existing now in a world entirely unlike the one it came from. The Pokédex notes that it tends to be violent, which might be the natural response to waking in a world nothing like the one you knew. Snorlax blocks an entire road in the original games, sleeping so heavily that nothing short of a musical performance from a flute can disturb it. It eats up to 900 pounds of food per day and then sleeps, the two activities accounting for almost all of its time. Its Pokédex entries describe it as not moving unless hungry, which is a kind of perfect efficiency, a creature that has reduced its life to exactly what it needs. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres are the three legendary birds of the Kanto region, each inhabiting a location at the edge of the game's traversable world. Their cry sounds are among the most recognizable in the original games, each distinct, each carrying the weight of rarity. They are creatures that exist in the parts of the map most players reach only after most of the journey is already done, rewards placed at the edges by designers who understood that distance adds meaning to arrival. Dratini was once described in the anime as a mythical Pokémon believed by many not to exist, a creature whose existence was considered a rumor before someone produced one as proof. The Safari Zone in the original games allowed players to fish for Dratini, turning the mythical into the obtainable, which is one of the quieter satisfactions the original games offered. Dragonair is described as possessing a body so beautiful and movement so graceful that some who see it in person believe they have witnessed something sacred. The orbs on its body and at the tip of its tail are described as capable of affecting the weather in the surrounding area. Something about Dragonair has always felt like it belongs slightly outside the ordinary world, even within a world already full of extraordinary creatures. Dragonite can fly around the globe in 16 hours, according to its Pokédex entries. It is described as a kind and intelligent creature that rescues people lost at sea, guiding ships through storms toward safe shore. The enormous winged shape that carries the round, orange, almost friendly face has always been a source of gentle fascination. The powerful and the approachable sharing a form in a way that shouldn't work, but consistently does. Mewtwo is a creature created through genetic engineering, described as the result of years of gruesome experiment conducted to produce the most powerful Pokémon possible. The Pokédex entries across multiple games describe a creature in persistent pain from its own creation, a being that has no true origin in nature and carries the weight of that absence in every entry. The first Pokémon movie centered on Mewtwo's attempt to understand what it was, and whether a created thing deserves what a natural thing has. The film was the highest-grossing animated film of 1999 in the United States, a record held briefly but meaningfully. Mew was described at the time of the original game's release as a creature so rare that its existence was rumored rather than confirmed. Discovering that Mew could be obtained through a particular sequence of actions in the original games, a glitch rather than an intended path, became one of the most shared secrets in early Pokémon culture. Whether discovered in the schoolyard or learned from a magazine, the Mew glitch was one of the first viral pieces of Pokémon knowledge, shared horizontally among players, before most of them knew what a walkthrough was. Chikorita was introduced in the second generation, a gentle grass-type starter shaped like a small dinosaur with a leaf at the tip of its head. In the anime, the Chikorita that Ash eventually caught was notably stubborn, resistant to being caught, and then resistant to accepting its place on the team before eventually becoming intensely loyal. The arc of difficult beginning and earned trust is one the anime returned to often, but Chikorita's version of it felt particularly specific. Cyndaquil curls into a ball when frightened, the flames on its back being the most reliable indicator of its emotional state, blazing when excited and barely flickering when frightened or cold. The small, hunched posture of Cyndaquil, the head tucked and the back arched, is one of the most recognizable silhouettes from the second generation. Totodile is described as having such powerful jaws that even a playful bite can cause serious injury to its trainer. The Pokédex notes that it often bites things without intending harm, that the strength of the grip simply exceeds what it consciously controls. Good intentions and powerful jaws are a combination that requires care on both sides. Ladybug communicates with others of its kind, using scents produced by a fluid it secretes. The scent changing to convey different information across a range of social signals. When the temperature drops, Ladybug gather together in large groups for warmth, forming a mass of small bodies that share heat across the cluster. Community as survival, warmth as something distributed rather than held. Spinarak weaves webs that some of its Pokédex entries describe as strong enough to hold prey without snapping even under significant force. Its entries note that it can remain perfectly still for as long as 3 days, waiting for something to enter the web, a patience that most creatures cannot sustain for anything close to that duration. Chinchou generates electricity by combining positive and negative charges produced in organs at the end of its antennae. It is described as living in depths of the ocean dark enough that the light from its own body is one of the few visible things in the surrounding environment. Deep water Pokémon tend to exist in entries that feel particularly separate from the surface world, their descriptions arriving from a place the games cannot quite take the player. Pichu was the pre-evolutionary form of Pikachu introduced in the second generation, a small form that is still gathering control over its own electrical ability. Touching Pichu can cause a shock, even when it doesn't intend one. Its entries note that it startles itself with its own discharges, which gives it an endearing quality, a creature still learning the nature of what it contains. Cleffa and Igglybuff were similarly introduced in the second generation as baby forms of existing Pokémon, a category that retroactively gave earlier creatures a childhood they hadn't originally had. The baby forms arrived with new breeding mechanics, making the pre-evolutions available only through eggs, which gave them a different relationship to the game's systems than Pokémon caught in the wild. Togepi was famously the first second-generation Pokémon shown publicly, carried in Misty's arms through the end of the first season of the anime, and most of the second before the rest of the generation's Pokémon were introduced. It existed as a preview and as a presence, a small creature in a cracked eggshell that said there was more coming without saying what. Natu is a small Pokémon that can see the future with its large eyes, but only in flashes, and only of events that will definitely occur. The distinction the Pokédex draws is that Natu does not see possibilities, but certainties, which is either a gift or a burden, depending on what those certainties contain. Mareep is described as having wool that stores electricity, building up a charge as it walks until the static is visible in the glow of its tail bulb. Shorn wool from Mareep apparently retains the electrical charge even after removal, which makes it both a source of electricity and a warning label in the same material. Meryl's ears are said to be capable of detecting the sounds of prey beneath the surface of a river from a significant distance. It floats on water without sinking, held up by the oil its tail contains. The small, round shape and the bobbing movement across water surfaces are among the second generation's gentler visual memories. Sudowoodo is a rock-type Pokémon that disguises itself as a tree, holding its arms out in a shape that resembles branches and remaining still when approached. It avoids water, which would immediately expose it, and its Pokédex notes that it flees from rain. The performance of being something else, maintained so thoroughly that most creatures pass by without looking twice. Ipom's hand is at the end of its tail rather than at the end of its arms, the limb having become so dexterous and dominant that the arms have become secondary. The Pokédex notes that Apom uses the tail hand for almost everything, holding objects, swinging through branches, grasping what it wants. The hand that arrived where no one expected a hand remains the hand most used. Sunkern is recognized within the games as the Pokémon with the lowest base stat total of any species in the series. Every number that defines what Sunkern can do in battle is as small as possible, and yet Sunkern evolves into Sunflora, a considerably more capable creature, which is a reminder that where something begins does not necessarily determine where it ends. Yanma can hover in a fixed position by beating its four wings at a frequency that creates a shockwave, described in the Pokédex as capable of breaking windows in the surrounding area. The eyes cover most of its head and give it vision in almost every direction simultaneously, a creature that can see what is coming from any angle. Wooper walks on land at night when the temperature drops and the slime coating its body changes character depending on temperature, becoming a different kind of protection in the cold. Its gills are visible on its head, and it breathes through them while in water, the visible biology of a creature comfortable in more than one element. Unown is a Pokémon shaped like letters, a full alphabet plus punctuation marks, each one technically a different form of the same species. Their origins are connected in lore to ancient writing systems, with ruins throughout the games containing inscriptions made of what later became clear were living Pokémon. Whether the Pokémon came first or the alphabet came first is a question the lore entertains without resolving. Wobbuffet cannot use any damaging moves of its own, only countering attacks directed at it. It is the definitive reactive Pokémon, one that can only respond and never initiate. Its body hides its tail, described in some entries as the real creature, with the blue body being a decoy. The performance of the body, concealing the actual identity beneath, is a detail that changes everything about how Wobbuffet reads. Girafarig's tail has a head of its own with a small brain, described as capable of biting anything that comes near from behind. The front and back of Girafarig are fundamentally different in their awareness, the front facing forward and the rear facing backward with separate instincts. Two ends of one creature that can disagree. Pineko hangs from pine trees, resembling a pine cone, closely enough that it is frequently overlooked. When threatened, it explodes, the shell fragmenting outward in an act of defense that destroys the disguise in the act of protecting it. After each explosion, Pineko rebuilds its own shell, which is a particular kind of patience. Fortress is almost entirely sealed within its shell, and its interior is never visible in the games. When enemies approach, it fires the contents of its body at them, then reseals itself completely. The Pokédex admits that what the inside of Fortress looks like has never been confirmed. Another hidden interior, another creature that keeps its true form behind a visible surface. Dunsparce is a small normal type Pokémon that has never evolved in the main series, despite many years of fan speculation that it would. In Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, an evolution called Dunsparce was finally introduced, bringing resolution to a question that had been open since the second generation. The new form is essentially a longer Dunsparce with an additional body segment, which some found anticlimactic and others found perfectly appropriate. Gligar moves by spreading its limbs and gliding through the air, latching onto the faces of enemies and stinging them with the barb at the tip of its tail. Its approach is quiet and lateral, something arriving from the side rather than from above or below. The angle of arrival distinguishes Gligar from most other flying types. Snubbull is a fairy-type Pokémon, described in the Pokédex as having a face so fierce it frightens other Pokémon, despite being quite gentle in nature. The mismatch between appearance and personality is noted in several entries, the creature routinely misread by the world around it. It is listed as a Pokémon popular among fashionable women in the cities, which is one of the more specific social details the Pokédex provides. Quillfish stores water in its body to inflate itself, the pressure building until it can fire the spikes that cover its surface at enemies. The Pokédex notes that the inflation is involuntary when it absorbs water too quickly, making the defense sometimes unintentional, a creature occasionally startled into its own most formidable form. Shuckle holds the record for the highest defense and special defense stats among all Pokémon that are not in legendary or mythical categories, alongside one of the lowest offensive stats. It stores berries inside its shell, and the fermented juice produced by the decomposing berries can dissolve almost any material. The most defensive creature in the entire series makes a liquid that eats through stone, which is a kind of irony the Pokédex provides without comment. Heracross is described as possessing strength capable of throwing a Snorlax, a Pokémon that weighs over 400 kilograms, by locking its horn underneath it and launching upward. The combination of the physical capability and the specific target referenced in the Pokédex makes the entry more vivid than most. Sneasel is a dark and ice-type Pokémon whose claws it can extend and retract at will. It is described as a creature that steals the eggs from nests by working in coordinated groups, one distracting the parent while another grabs what they came for. The Pokédex doesn't often describe coordinated strategy among non-legendary Pokémon, which makes Sneasel's entry feel slightly different from the creatures around it. Teddiursa's paw is described as always covered in honey, the creature constantly licking it throughout the day. Before a full moon, Teddiursa is described as gathering more honey in preparation, storing what it can while the light is fullest. The habit connects to something ancient, a creature following patterns it has always followed without needing to know why. Ursaring marks the trees of its territory by standing upright and scratching the bark at maximum height, the mark serving as a warning to other Ursaring of the territory's occupation. Also, the Pokédex notes that Ursaring can smell food through thick layers of soil, finding buried provisions without needing to see them, something below the surface found through the patience of simply standing still and breathing in. Slugma never sleeps. Its Pokédex entries note that if it stops moving, the magma circulating through its body would cool and harden, and it would cease to function. It moves constantly to stay alive, the motion inseparable from the life itself, a creature for whom stillness is not rest but ending. Magcargo's body temperature is described as reaching 1,800 degrees Celsius at its highest, hot enough that water turns instantly to steam and rocks and dirt melt on contact. Despite this, its shell is described as extremely fragile, shattering if touched, the most dangerous heat contained in the most delicate structure. Swinub can detect underground hot springs by smell and will push snow away with its nose to reach them, warming itself in the steam that rises through the ground. The detection of buried warmth beneath cold surfaces is a specific and useful capability for a creature that lives in places where snow is the dominant landscape. Piloswine's the thick fur covers its eyes almost completely, leaving it navigating primarily through its sense of smell and its curved tusks, which it uses to break through ice. The obscured vision and the reliance on other senses give Piloswine a way of moving through the world that most Pokémon do not share. Corsola is a coral Pokémon described in older games as forming large colonies in warm, clear water and providing shelter and habitat for other water-type Pokémon. In Pokémon Sword and Shield, a Galarian form of Corsola was introduced as a ghost type, the entry explaining that it was bleached and killed by rapidly changing water temperatures and now exists as a spirit. The same Pokémon in two forms across two games, one alive and one not, the change between them caused by something recognizable. Remoraid clings to the underside of Mantine and fires water jets with precision enough to hit targets at long range. The relationship between Remoraid and Mantine is one of the clearer mutualistic arrangements described in the Pokédex, each benefiting from the other's presence. When Remoraid evolves into Octillery, the relationship ends, the evolved form no longer attached to the creature it grew alongside. Delibird is one of only two Pokémon in the entire series that can only learn one move naturally, that move being present. It carries food and presents in its tail and distributes them during travel, occasionally giving food that actually deals damage instead of healing. The mistake is built into the move itself, kindness that sometimes goes wrong. Houndour and Houndoom work in packs, coordinating through howls that the Pokédex describes as a communication system complex enough to assign roles in a group hunt. Storm. Houndoom's flame is described as producing a burn that never fully heals, the pain persisting even after the wound closes. The contrast between the social coordination and the irreversible injury exists without resolution in the Pokédex. Kingdra is a Pokémon described as living in deep ocean caves, creating whirlpools that reach the surface when it yawns. The water currents caused by its yawning are described as powerful enough to overturn large ships. The inadvertent power of rest, the most passive action causing the most visible disturbance in the water above. Fanpei rolls into a ball when threatened, the tough blue hide making it difficult to damage while it waits for the threat to pass. It is described as having enough physical strength to accidentally knock down trees it leans against, a creature whose affectionate impulses occasionally exceed the objects they are directed toward. Donphin's tusks are described as hard enough to scratch metal, and the rollout attack it is known for in the anime increases in power with each revolution. The leather-like hide is described as so tough that even heavy machinery cannot dent it, which makes the rounded form of Donphin both more and less approachable, depending on what angle you read it from. Stantler's antlers are noted in the Pokédex as capable of distorting the surrounding air when moved in certain ways, creating illusions visible to anyone nearby. The Pokédex entries in some games note that someone who stares into the holes in the antlers will fall into a trance. Stantler is a quiet creator of unreality, a Pokémon that makes the world temporarily into something else. Smeargle uses a liquid secreted from the tip of its tail as paint, and it marks its territory with paintings whose complexity increases with age. The Pokédex notes that Smeargle living in large colonies cover every surface of their environment in these markings until no original surface remains visible. Whatever was there before is gone beneath the record of what has passed through. Tyrogue is the only Pokémon in the main series whose evolution is determined entirely by the relationship between two of its stats at the time of evolving. If attack is higher than defense, it becomes Hitmonlee. If defense is higher than attack, it becomes Hitmonchan. If the two are equal, it becomes Hitmontop. The creature's future is written in the balance of what it has developed, which is one of the more mechanically unusual evolutions in the games. Smoochum is described as checking its reflection whenever it can, pressing its lips to reflective surfaces to examine its own face. The Pokédex notes that it is upset when it finds its face dirty and immediately tries to clean it, a creature with a consistent standard for its own appearance that it applies wherever it goes. Illica generates electricity by rotating its arms rapidly, building a charge visible in the flickering between the horns on its head. It cannot stop this motion while generating electricity, a constant physical process that the creature sustains for as long as it needs to. Magby is described as breathing small fireballs when it walks, the temperature of each breath a measure of its health. A healthy Magby's flames are described as yellow with a red tip, while a weakened one's burn with a different character. The body's condition made legible through what it produces. Miltank's milk is described as so nutritious and rich that even seriously weakened Pokémon recover quickly after drinking it. The Miltank in the Pokémon anime, owned by a gym leader named Whitney, became one of the more memorable opponents in the early series. Its rollout attack defeating many players' teams in a game that offered few reliable counters to it at that stage of progression. Blissey succeeds Chansey as the most generous creature in the Pokédex, its entries describing a Pokémon that rushes to comfort any creature it senses, is in pain, producing and sharing its eggs freely with any who approach it in distress. Its defense is notably low, but its special defense and hit points are among the highest in the series. It absorbs damage not through hardness, but through an enormous capacity to endure. Raikou, Entei, and Suicune are the three legendary beast Pokémon of the Johto region. Their origin is described in the games as connected to a fire that destroyed the Brass Tower in Ecruteak City. Three unnamed Pokémon who perished in the blaze and were revived by Ho-Oh as something new. The three roam across the Johto region rather than residing in fixed locations, making them among the most dynamic legendary Pokémon in the series to actually pursue. Lugia is the mascot of Pokémon Silver and is described in the game as so powerful that the weather changes around it, making ordinary flight impossible through the turbulence its wings create. It lives in the ocean rather than the sky for this reason, submerged deep enough that its presence doesn't affect the surface, power that must hide from the consequences of itself. Ho-Oh is described in the Pokédex as appearing after rain, and any creature that sees it is described as guaranteed eternal happiness. It carries the sacred ash, an item within the games capable of reviving all fainted Pokémon simultaneously, the most complete restoration item in the series, attached to the creature that represents rebirth. Its feathers are described as changing color, depending on the angle of light, 7 different colors visible in the right moment. Celebi, the mythical Pokémon that concludes the second generation's Pokédex, travels through time, appearing in forests where it is at peace. Its presence causes flowers to bloom around it, the land responding to its arrival. It is described as a guardian of the forest and of time simultaneously, which makes it one of the broader responsibilities held by any single Pokémon. Trieko was one of the Generation 3 starters, a small gecko-shaped grass type whose Pokédex entries describe it as fearless in the face of larger opponents, refusing to show any reaction to intimidation. The calm that does not break under pressure is described as a feature of the creature's character rather than a performance of bravery. Torchic produces fire in its stomach that it breathes when battling, and the Pokédex notes that newly hatched Torchic cuddle against their trainers for warmth, the small body generating a gentle heat. The starter Pokémon of a region carry the first impression of that region's warmth, and Torchic's version of it is specifically domestic, close and small and present. Mudkip's fin on its head detects changes in air and water currents, allowing it to sense approaching danger through the movement of the surrounding environment. Swampert, its fully evolved form, can drag enormous boulders, described in certain entries as weighing a ton, and is resistant to all special types except grass, making its type combination one of the most defensively useful in the generation it came from. Wurmple evolves into one of two different second stage forms at random, with no visible indicator of which path it will take until the evolution occurs. Silcoon and Cascoon are both cocoon stages, with nearly identical appearances but distinct evolutions. The path is hidden inside the creature, determined but invisible, the outcome only known when it arrives. Ralts is described in the Pokédex as being extremely sensitive to the emotions of the people around it, hiding when negative feelings are present and approaching only when it senses joy or kindness in the surrounding area. It is a creature drawn to warmth and repelled by its absence, which makes the choice of trainer particularly significant for a Ralts' willingness to be present. Gardevoir is described as capable of creating a small black hole to protect its trainer when threatened, the space around it bending under the force it generates. Later entries note that Gardevoir has no concept of self-preservation in this scenario, generating the black hole regardless of the danger to itself. The devotion exceeds the instinct to survive, which is the Pokédex's most intense expression of loyalty. Shedinja is one of the strangest evolutions in the series. When Ninjask evolves from Nincada, if there is an open space in the party and the player has an extra Pokeball, a second Pokémon appears, Shedinja, the discarded shell of the evolution. It has exactly one hit point and cannot be damaged by any direct attack, only by weather, status effects, and moves that bypass its ability. The ghost in the shell that is also the shell left behind when the creature moved forward. Shroomish is described as capable of releasing spores so toxic they cause a Pokémon to become incapable of movement for 3 days. The release happens when Shroomish is angered, and the direction of the spores is controlled with some precision. A creature otherwise peaceful, the spores a response rather than an impulse. Slakoth is described as sleeping over 20 hours a day and moving so little that algae grow on its body. In the few hours it is active, it eats only the leaves within reach without standing. The economy of motion is absolute. Slaking, its final evolution, has the highest attack stat of any non-legendary Pokémon in the generation, the sleepiness covering an enormous potential that surfaces only reluctantly. Nosepass points consistently toward magnetic north, its stone nose acting as a compass. Wherever Nosepass stands, it faces the same direction. The magnetic pull is so strong that two Nosepass cannot approach each other closely without the force between them preventing contact. The same orientation, the same direction, unable to meet. Skitty is described as captivated by anything moving, chasing its own tail and swinging objects until exhausted. It purrs in vibrations, described as putting other Pokémon in a comfortable, drowsy state, which makes Skitty's presence near a sleeping party something between accident and lullaby. Mowila's horns were once the leaves of a plant that evolved over generations into their current shape, the false mouth at the back of its head described as capable of crushing iron beams. Its expression at the front remains gentle, the real danger hidden at the back where the actual jaw opens. The surface presented and the capability concealed are entirely different things. Metatite meditates every day, the sessions described as an absolute requirement, the Pokédex noting that if it misses a day, its focus is broken and it has to start its training over. The consistency of the practice is more important than any single session, the routine itself being what builds the ability. Plusle and Minun are described as a pairing, the two Pokémon encouraging each other by touching paws and passing current between them. Plusle cheers for its partner by releasing plus-charged sparks from its body, while Minun cries electricity when its partner is losing. The two have almost identical stats and are most commonly seen together, two creatures defined more by their relationship to each other than by anything independent. Volbeat and Illumisi are described in the Pokédex as using patterns of light to communicate with each other in the night, Volbeat drawing shapes with the glow at the tip of its tail, Illumisi guiding the pattern by drawing Volbeat in new directions. The conversation happens entirely in light and movement, the two creatures writing something in the air that only they can fully read. Roselia's thorns are poisonous on all three of its arm flowers, and the Pokédex notes that the flowers grow more beautiful when the soil it grows in is particularly rich with nutrients. A creature whose quality is directly visible in its appearance, the quality of what feeds it, written into the color and condition of what it displays. Gulpin is almost entirely stomach, the Pokédex noting that nearly its entire body mass is digestive organ, capable of consuming something as large as itself in a single swallow. The small face and the tiny limbs surround something that is almost nothing else, a digestive system given the minimum external features necessary to move toward the next meal. Cacnea is described as surviving in extremely arid environments by storing water in its body and absorbing moisture from the air during the night. It attaches to passing creatures by stabbing them with its needles, holding on as a way of traveling to new locations. The technique is not kind to the creature being used for transport, but Cacnea's desert is not a kind environment. Zangoose and Seviper are described as natural enemies, their generations of conflict with each other having become instinctive, each triggering a threat response in the other, regardless of individual experience. The hostility between them is built into what they are, rather than what they have personally encountered, which is one of the more philosophically interesting Pokédex entries in the series. Lunatone and Solrock were discovered at the site of a meteorite impact, which the Pokédex implies is their actual origin, the two having arrived from elsewhere. They are connected to the moon and the sun respectively, and the entries note that they do not require food, having no apparent digestive system. What sustains them is not addressed directly. Barboach's whiskers cover its body with a slime that prevents anything from gripping it, making it almost impossible to hold. Its entire body is designed around not being grabbed, the resistance to capture built into the texture of its surface. Claydol is described as an ancient clay figure, given life by a mysterious ray of light, its Pokédex entries suggesting it has existed since before recorded history in the Pokémon world. It moves without any visible means of locomotion, floating, and has eyes covering its body in every direction. It does not speak in any language recognized by humans, though it is described as possessing significant intelligence by multiple entries. Melodic is described in the Pokédex as one of the most beautiful Pokémon in existence, capable of calming anyone who sees it, reducing hostile intent, and bringing peace to aggressive situations. It is said that conflict ends in its presence, that wars have ceased when a Melodic appeared. The claim is large and the creature quiet, which is perhaps the point. Tropius grows fruit from its neck that can be eaten, producing a harvest twice a year that local children are described as particularly fond of. The leaves it uses for flight are attached to its back, and it is one of the only Pokémon described as providing food to the people around it as an ongoing natural function. Chimecho is described in the Pokédex as clinging to trees by a suction cup on its head, releasing in storms to drift through the air. It makes sounds described in some entries as so beautiful that anyone who hears them loses the will to move. The bell shape and the sound it produces feel connected, the body being the instrument and the wind the reason for playing it. Absol appears before disasters, drawn to locations where catastrophe is about to occur. Because of this, it has historically been blamed for causing the disasters it was trying to warn against. The Pokédex notes with some sadness that Absol has been misunderstood this way for generations, the messenger blamed for the message, the presence mistaken for the cause. Winot is a pre-evolution of Wobbuffet that gathers with others of its kind to compete in pushing contests, the strength of the push determining social standing. They huddle together at night in groups for warmth, the contact another form of measurement, shared space as something both practical and expressive. Snorunt is described as living in extremely cold regions and eating ice and snow as part of its diet. Its hut-shaped body retains heat by being open at the bottom, the creature's own warmth circulating inside the hollow form. Shelter and creature as the same shape. Spheal is described as rolling everywhere rather than walking because the round body makes rolling faster. It claps when happy, the sound echoing across ice fields. The entries note that explorers in cold regions sometimes hear the clapping and know that Spheal are nearby, which is a gentle form of company. Clampral's pearl, produced inside its shell over many years, is described in some entries as being worth more than a luxury cruise by modern standards. The pearl is the evidence of a long patience, produced slowly by a creature that does not rush anything. Huntail and Goribus are both evolved forms of Clampral, each requiring a different item to trigger the evolution, and each adapting to the deep ocean in a different way. Huntail is described as living at depths so extreme that the light never reaches it, using the glowing light on its tail to lure prey. Goribus drains nutrients through a thin mouth, described in certain entries in terms that make it one of the more quietly alarming Pokémon in the Pokédex. Relicanth is described as having existed unchanged for 100 million years. It is a living fossil, having reached a form so effective for its environment that evolution found no improvement to make. The stillness of 100 million years, unchanged, the world flowing past while the creature held its shape. Luvdisk is small and heart-shaped, and its Pokédex entries describe it as attaching itself to couples, the presence of Luvdisk considered a sign of lasting love in some regions. When couples who have found each other are near the water, Luvdisk is described as approaching and swimming with them. Whether the attachment is instinct or choice, the Pokédex does not say. Bagon dreams of flight despite having no wings, the Pokédex entries noting that it repeatedly hurls itself from high places in an attempt to fly, the head described as becoming increasingly hard from repeated impacts. The evolution line builds towards Salamence, which does fly, which means the persistent failure at the start of the line is not failure, but patience expressed in the only way available. Metung is described as being formed from two Beldum merging, the magnetic field both combining into a stronger one. The thought processes of both Beldum continue in Metung simultaneously, two intelligences sharing one body, which makes decisions more complex and the resulting creature more capable than either component was alone. Regirock, Regise, and Registeel are three ancient Pokémon sealed away by a civilization whose records have been lost. The Regi group communicate through a pattern of dots on their bodies that has been described in different games as an unknown language that no current researchers have decoded. They exist in the present, but belong to a time that the current world no longer remembers. Latios and Latias are Eon Pokémon described as being able to fly faster than jet aircraft, folding their arms against their bodies to minimize resistance. Latias can refract light around itself to become invisible, and Latias can understand human speech despite not speaking it. The two are described as needing each other's presence, the pair functioning differently when separated from each other than when together. Kyogre and Groudon are described as having fought each other since ancient times, Kyogre expanding the seas and Groudon expanding the land, the conflict between them responsible for the shape of the world as it currently exists. The battle described in the mythology of the Huan region was not between good and evil, but between competing forms of expansion, each enormous creature trying to create more of what it represented. Rayquaza floats in the ozone layer, consuming meteorites for sustenance, and was described as the force that ended the ancient war between Kyogre and Groudon. It arrived from a height above the conflict and imposed a stillness that neither of the two creatures had chosen. The third party above the battle, calming it not through power over either side, but through presence. Jirachi grants wishes when it awakens for 7 days every 1,000 years. The Pokédex entries describe a creature almost never awake, its existence defined by an enormous patience, about 1,000 years of sleep for 7 days of presence. Whether the wishes it grants are real within the game's world is something only a few side events and films address. Deoxys is a space virus that mutated when exposed to laser light, gaining a physical form capable of multiple configurations. It can alter between 4 forms that specialize in attack, defense, speed, and balance, the same origin expressed through different choices about what to emphasize. The alien creature that arrived from outside the Pokémon world's ecology and found ways to be whatever the situation needed. Turtwig is described as having a shell made of soil that grows harder as the Pokémon drinks more water. When Turtwig is healthy, a small spring trickles from the top of its head, visible proof of the water content maintained in the creature's body, the health of the inside expressed as something flowing from the outside. Chimchar's fire burns even in the rain, the flame generated from a gas produced in the stomach rather than from the surrounding air. The independence of the fire from weather conditions makes Chimchar unusual among fire types, whose flames are sometimes described as being affected by temperature or wind. Piplup is described as being too proud to accept help from a trainer at first, frequently falling over on the ice and refusing assistance in the process of standing back up. The stubbornness before trust is established, and the slow adjustment to partnership are traits its Pokédex entries describe, rather than the game's demonstrating directly. Kricketo communicates by colliding its antennae together, the resulting sound described as resembling a xylophone. The instrument the creature becomes when it communicates is built into its own body, the signal and the sound inseparable from the anatomy of the sender. Budew is described as releasing more pollen when the air is warm and humid, the discharge triggered by temperature rather than choice. The pollen causes symptoms similar to hay fever in anyone who breathes it in significant quantity, something passive in the creature affecting those around it in a way Budew does not intend. Cranidos is described as having a skull so hard it can shatter anything it headbutts, the frontal bone having been reinforced through evolution to a remarkable degree. The strength is entirely localized to one part of the body, everything else remaining vulnerable, the investment in one capability absolute. Shieldon's face is described as being harder than any metal currently known, but its body is soft and easily injured from behind. The same asymmetry as Cranidos, but inverted, one complete protection and one complete vulnerability, the choice made once in an ancient lineage and maintained ever since. Burmy changes its cloak depending on its environment, taking on material from whatever surrounds it when it covers itself. In a forest, it wears leaves and branches. In sandy areas, it wears dirt and grit. In buildings, it wears fabric and thread. The coat it makes is always from what the world around it offers, the creature defining itself through what is immediately available. Combi is a Pokémon with 3 faces, each one capable of producing a different honey. Only female Combi can evolve into Vespiquen, which makes female Combi significantly more sought after than male by collectors focused on evolution. Male Combi have no further form, remaining in the 3-faced configuration they were born with. Cherubi stores nutrients in the small round ball attached to its body, the ball growing sweeter as it grows smaller, the reserves depleting even as the taste improves. When the ball is consumed entirely, Cherim evolves, the end of something small causing the beginning of something else. Shellos and Gastrodon exist in 2 forms, one found on the west side of Sinnoh and one on the east, the forms having developed separately in populations divided by the mountain range that crosses the region. The Pokédex notes that the 2 forms have been completely isolated long enough that their appearances have diverged, which is the game's gentlest description of what evolution does when time and separation are provided. Drifblim is described as floating upward when evening comes, drifting with the air currents through the night in groups visible in the sky above roads and fields. Its Pokédex entries note that it sometimes carries off children who grab onto its body expecting it to be something else, the size and the shape resembling a balloon closely enough that the mistake is understandable. The floating continues regardless. Baniri's ears are said to contain the entirety of its energy when curled around its head, releasing that energy in a strike that creates extreme cold on contact. When the ears are unfurled and waving, Baniri is described as in a good mood. The visible mood indicator, built into the most visible part of the body, legible to anyone who looks. Mismagus creates incantations from sounds it produces, and those who hear the sounds experience different illusions depending on the content of the incantation. Some enter states of bliss, others experience intense suffering. The distinction between the 2 is internal to the incantation rather than visible from outside. Honchkrow is described as calling upon large numbers of Murkrow to do its bidding through a single cry, the subordinates arriving quickly and in numbers. It rarely does anything itself, the management of others being its primary activity. A Pokémon that leads through sound rather than demonstration. Purugly makes other Pokémon's territories its own by forcing the original occupants out. Its Pokédex notes that it wraps its tails around its body to appear larger than it actually is before confronting territory holders, the performance of size preceding the actual interaction. Appearance is the first move in a negotiation that Purugly intends to win. Spiritomb was formed from 108 spirits that were bound together as punishment for past misdeeds. It has no type weaknesses in its original generation, the combination of Dark and Ghost removing all typical vulnerabilities. In later generations, a new type was introduced that can affect it, breaking the immunity that had persisted for 3 game generations. Gible is described as hiding in caves in desert areas where the temperature drops sharply at night, the cave holding daytime warmth. It lunges at anything that passes within its field of vision from inside the cave, the attack a reflex before a choice, the wait inside the warmth, the lunge into whatever arrives, the cycle repeated. Lucario is described as reading the auras of the creatures around it, perceiving intention and emotion as clearly as sound or sight. Its entries note that it understands human speech and is considered a noble and honest Pokémon, its aura perception making deception visible to it in a way that prevents it from being misled easily. Hippopotas releases sand from its pores instead of sweat, its body generating a constant discharge that creates a small sandstorm in its immediate vicinity. 2 Hippopotas together would merge their sandstorms into something considerably larger, which is why the Pokédex describes other Pokémon moving away from groups of them. Skorupi is described as burying itself just below the surface of the sand, with only its tail visible, waiting for passing prey to touch the tail before striking, the whole body concealed except the trigger, the patience of a creature that has reduced the visible portion of itself to exactly the element that does the work. Croagunk produces a poison from its cheeks that acts on the nervous system, causing pain disproportionate to the wound. Its Pokédex entries in some games note that it is used by medical researchers because its poison, in very small doses, has curative properties. The same substance harmful in excess and helpful in restraint. Carnivine hangs from branches by its tentacles and waits with its mouth open, releasing a sweet scent that draws insects toward it. The setup requires patience measured in hours, the hanging position maintained through the effort of the tentacles, while the mouth contributes nothing beyond being open and waiting. Finian is described as absorbing sunlight through the fins it uses to swim, storing the energy as a light that glows after dark. The fins carry the day's light into the night, the creature's storage of what it absorbed becoming visible only when the source is gone. Luminion uses the patterns of light on its fins to attract prey in deep water, drawing others toward it in the dark. The light it makes is its own, created from energy stored in the body, made visible by a system the creature was born with. Mantike is described as following in the wake of boats and ships, swimming behind them to take advantage of the reduced drag. It attaches itself to Remoraid when young, and the Remoraid help Mantike navigate in exchange for protection from larger creatures. The arrangement is mutual and described as beginning very early in Mantike's life. Snover grows berries on its body that are conical and can be used as food. It lives in high-altitude snow and is described as approaching humans with curiosity rather than caution, making it one of the more immediately trusting Pokémon in the 4th generation. Abomasnow causes blizzards wherever it walks, the snow responding to its presence. It is described as appearing only when snow has already begun and staying only through the winter, retreating to higher elevations when the season ends. A creature whose presence is seasonal and whose departure marks a change in the world around it. Weavile is described as one of the most intelligent Pokémon in the Ice-type category, communicating through claw marks in trees and hunting in coordinated groups using signals that other species cannot interpret. The communication system the group maintains is described as complex enough to be considered a language, which is a distinction the Pokédex does not often draw. Magnezone is described as being able to magnetize Pokémon in its vicinity without warning, trapping metal-bearing creatures in place. It evolved from Magneton when exposed to a specific magnetic field in a certain area, the environment completing the evolution rather than leveling or items. Lickilicky's tongue reaches deep enough into its own stomach to manipulate what it has swallowed, and it can use the tongue to pass objects from one place to another with precision. The tongue that grew into something beyond a tongue, becoming the most capable part of the creature, rather than simply one part of many. Tangrowth's vines grow so quickly that they are described as needing to be trimmed regularly to prevent them from overtaking surrounding plant life. The entire body is vines, as it was in Tangela, and the evolution is expressed not in a change of structure, but in a growth of the same structure to a degree that the original could not reach. Electivire is described as pressing its two tails against an opponent and delivering enough electrical charge to power an entire region for over a minute. The two tails are the delivery system, and the charge is described as visible from a significant distance, the light of the discharge crossing into the range of something comparable to natural lightning. Magmortar fires fireballs from the tube-shaped appendages at the end of its arms, described as reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees at the point of emission. The arm has become the weapon, the original hand shape transformed over its evolution into something that does one thing with enormous precision. Togekiss is described as appearing only where there is no conflict, the creature avoiding any area where fighting or hostility is present. It shares a blessed wind described in some entries as bringing good fortune to those it passes over. A creature that chooses peace, not as philosophy but as requirement, the conflict-free environment being the only one it can inhabit. Yanmega is described as capable of creating shock waves from its wing beats powerful enough to cause internal injuries in opponents without contact. The air displacement alone, the flight path drawn through space, changes the space it passes through. Leafeon is the grass-type evolution of Eevee, its cells described as functioning identically to those of plants, capable of photosynthesis. It is described as sleeping in sunlight for much of the day, breathing air so clean that the surrounding environment is visibly improved, a creature that purifies the air around it as a byproduct of being itself. Glacian controls the air around it to generate ice crystals, described as lowering the surrounding temperature to negative 58 degrees Celsius. Its fur conducts heat, capable of generating an ice crystal sharp enough to pierce deeply with contact. The cold it creates is both its defense and its nature, the temperature not applied but inhabited. Gliscor hangs upside down from branches, watching the ground below. Its attacks are described as happening too quickly for most opponents to track, the movement from hanging stillness to full speed happening in an interval too brief to respond to, the waiting posture concealing what it can become in a moment. Mamazwine is described as having gone extinct once after the last ice age, the warming climate that ended the glacial period being hostile to a creature built for cold. In recent games, it was noted that the population recovered as cold regions returned. The creature that went away and came back, the same form waiting in the cold for conditions to change. Porygon Z is described as having been created with additional code modifications that were meant to allow it to exist in alien computer systems. The modifications did not produce the intended result, and the behavior of Porygon Z is described as erratic. Something intended to expand capacity instead produced instability, the creature moving through digital space in ways that are unpredictable even to the system that created it. Gallade is the male evolution of Kirlia, and its arms have blades that extend when it engages in combat. It is described as a gentlemanly Pokémon that fights with precision and what the Pokédex describes as chivalry, anticipating an opponent's movements and responding with a care for the engagement that most fighting types do not express. Probopass is a regional evolution of Nosepass, developed in an area of strong magnetic fields, its magnetic field so powerful that it can pull iron objects from far away without moving. The small secondary faces attached to its body by magnetic force are described as capable of being detached and used as scouts, the creature deploying parts of itself into the surrounding space while remaining in place. Dusknoir receives transmissions from the spirit world through an antenna on its head, the instructions directing it to absorb those whose time has ended. The opening in its stomach is described as a gate, and what enters there does not return. The Pokédex entries around this are among the more direct descriptions of what happens in the presence of this Pokémon. Frostless is described as the spirit of a woman who became lost in mountains in the cold and was preserved by the environment, the form she took upon becoming a Pokémon carrying the shape of the ice and snow that changed her. Its entries describe it as freezing opponents it particularly likes and collecting them in its cave, a form of keeping that does not require the kept thing to continue in any ordinary sense. Rotom is a Pokémon that can inhabit and possess electrical appliances, taking on different types depending on which appliance it occupies. The appliance forms are the most unusual evolutions in the franchise in terms of what is technically happening, the Pokémon not changing its own body, but merging with something external to create a new configuration. Yuxi, Mesprit, and Azelf are the lake guardians of the Sinnoh region, three small Pokémon described as having created human knowledge, emotion, and willpower, respectively. The Pokédex entries for Yuxi note that it can erase the memories of anyone who sees its open eyes. The Guardian of Knowledge keeps that knowledge defended by taking it away from whoever looks too directly. Dialga controls time, described as the creature whose heartbeat sustains the flow of time in the Pokémon world. If Dialga were to stop, the entries imply time would stop with it. Palkia controls space in the same generation, the two together being responsible for the structure of the world. The beings that maintain the framework rather than inhabiting it. Giratina is described as having been banished to another dimension by Arceus for violent behavior. It inhabits the distortion world, a place where the laws of physics are inverted, the creature adjusting to a reality built on reversal. Whether the banishment produced the bitterness or the bitterness produced the banishment is something the Pokédex does not fully address. Cresselia creates pleasant dreams and is described as a natural counterpart to Darkrai, which creates nightmares. The two Pokémon are linked by purpose rather than evolution, existing in opposition without ever directly engaging with each other. A balance maintained through contrast, the pleasant dream and the nightmare coexisting because both are present. Manaphy is described as being born from eggs that must be kept at an exact temperature, and it is noted that when Manaphy is born far from the ocean, it makes every effort to return. The connection to the sea is described as fundamental rather than preference, the creature belonging to the water in a way that cannot be overcome by distance for very long. Darkrai causes nightmares in any creature that sleeps nearby. The nightmare's involuntary, a byproduct of Darkrai's presence, rather than an action it chooses to take. It is described as living on an island, specifically to keep its range of effect away from sleeping communities, the isolation chosen as a form of consideration toward others, loneliness as kindness, distance as protection. Shaman transforms between a small hedgehog shape and a winged deer form, the transformation triggered by the Grassidea flower. In its land form, it absorbs pollutants from the air and converts them into clean energy, leaving the surrounding environment fresher than it found it. Something harmful absorbed and turned into something useful, the process happening quietly and without ceremony. Arceus is described in the Pokédex as the creature that shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms, creating the world and the Pokémon that inhabit it. Its entry states that it emerged from an egg in a void before anything else existed. It is the beginning placed at the end of the National Pokédex, the origin given the last number, which is its own kind of comment on how these things are arranged. Victinique is said to bring victory to any trainer who holds it, the positive energy it carries described as infectious, spreading to those nearby. It is listed as number 0 in the Unova Pokédex, placed before all others in that region's system, the creature described as the bringer of good fortune, given the position that precedes everything else. Snivy is described as absorbing sunlight through its tail, photosynthesizing as it moves. When it is in poor health, its tail droops. The visible health indicator built into the visible shape, the posture of the tail telling what the creature's condition is before anything else does. Tepig is described as shooting fire from its nose when excited, the flame carrying with it a scent of roasting that the Pokédex describes as pleasant. When sad or unwell, the nose produces black smoke instead of fire, the substitution legible as a condition rather than a choice. Oshawott scallop shell weapon, called a Scalcop, is attached to its stomach and used both offensively in battle and as a tool for cracking open food. The same object serving two functions, the line between weapon and implement, not drawn clearly in the creature's understanding. Petret is described as an extremely vigilant Pokémon, almost never sleeping, eating very little, and maintaining constant watch from strategic positions. Its eyes are described as capable of seeing in multiple directions at once, the sacrifice of most ordinary creature comforts in exchange for unbroken awareness. Lilliput's long fur around its face is described as functioning as a sensor, picking up air movements and changes in environment that the creature responds to before other senses register them. The fur is the first thing to know something is changing, the rest of the creature following its lead. Blitzel is described as having a mane that accumulates electricity from the surrounding air and releases it in flashes that communicate with others of its kind. The signals are too quick for most creatures to read, the communication happening at a speed that excludes everyone not built for it. Zebstrika releases electricity in all directions when angered, the discharge uncontrolled and described as loud enough to be comparable to a thunderclap at close range. The emotion and the electricity are connected without a layer of intention between them, the feeling expressing itself immediately and completely. Roggenrola was discovered in a cave exposed by a volcanic eruption, the first specimens found in a newly created environment. Its Pokédex notes that it has an hexagonal core at its center that reverberates with sound and that it orients itself using the resonance. The internal structure used as a navigation system, the core vibrating to understand the world around it. Woobat uses echolocation to navigate, releasing ultrasonic waves and interpreting the return. When it attaches to something with the suction cup on its nose, the mark left behind is described as a heart shape, which has been noted in fan communities as one of the more accidentally charming biological details in any Pokédex entry. Excadrill digs tunnels that can reach over 100 meters underground, the passages it creates sometimes intersecting with subway systems built by humans. The two systems of tunnels, one made and one grown, occasionally meeting beneath the city. Audino heals those it touches, the feelers on its ears functioning as diagnostic tools that it uses to assess a Pokemon's condition before applying care. It is described as a gentle and curious creature that seeks out those in need rather than waiting for them to come to it. Timbira carries a small log everywhere it goes, the log growing larger as the Pokemon grows stronger, the weight it carries chosen to always be at the edge of manageable. The training is constant, the implement carried through every activity, the line between work and life not drawn. Timpole uses its head to generate sound waves that can travel through water, communicating with others too far away to see. It creates songs in groups, the combined sound described as beautiful enough to attract attention from distant creatures. The chorus as a form of presence, the sound reaching where the body cannot. Cottonade drifts on the wind, its cotton body providing enough lift to be carried by moderate breezes. Groups of Cottonee sometimes amass in the same air current and are described as moving together like a slow cloud, a gathering of small, soft bodies traveling in the same direction without coordination. Petilil is described as preferring to grow in rich, moist soil, and the leaves that grow from its head are described in certain games as having restorative properties when consumed, a creature whose parts are useful to the world around it, in a way it does not choose, but does not withhold. Basculin exists in two forms, red-striped and blue-striped, described as being in a constant state of aggression toward each other. The two forms of the same Pokemon treat each other as enemies, the stripe determining allegiance in a way that individual experience does not override. Sandile is described as moving through sand, with only its eyes and nose above the surface, the rest of the body hidden in the dune. The warmth of the sand is what sustains it, the creature living in the heat stored in the ground. Darumaka is described as having fire burning inside its body constantly, the heat so intense that its droppings are noted in the Pokédex as being used by people to warm themselves. The leftover warmth of what passes through the creature, carrying usefulness to the world around it. Maractus lives in arid regions and produces sounds by shaking itself in a rhythm, the rattling used to frighten away bird predators. It prefers sun and dryness, described as opening itself toward the light, in the same way the plants it resembles turn toward the source of what sustains them. Dwebble is a bug-type Pokémon that finds and carries rocks it hollows out to use as shells. When its rock is taken away, it becomes extremely agitated and panics until it can find a replacement. The rock is not part of the creature, but is inseparable from it, the anxiety of loss as real as the loss itself. Scraggy pulls its own loose skin up around its body as a defense, the skin described as thick enough to be highly resistant to most blows. The behavior is described in its entries as reflecting a Pokémon that is always prepared for conflict, the skin always ready to be pulled up before the next encounter begins. Sigilif is described as a creature that guards ancient ruins along fixed routes, repeating the patrol it was given by the ancient civilization that created it. The civilization is gone, and the reason for the patrol is no longer clear, but Sigilif continues, the behavior outlasting its original purpose. Yamask carries a mask that is described as the face the Pokémon wore when it was human. It sometimes holds the mask in front of its face and weeps. The Pokédex entry is one of the most directly sorrowful in the series, a creature carrying the image of what it used to be and grieving the distance between then and now. Cofagrigus is a sarcophagus Pokémon, described as capable of absorbing people who come too close and turning them into mummies. Its entries note that it pretends to be a decorated coffin until someone touches it. The disguise and the danger are the same object. Tortuga is a fossil Pokémon restored from a cover fossil, described as being the ancestor of most water-type Pokémon. It could swim at depths of the ancient ocean and was able to come ashore to lay eggs, the two environments accessible by the same creature in the time it came from. Archon is described as incapable of true flight, despite having wings, using them more as aids to movement on the ground and for leaping between elevated points. Its Pokédex notes that it is the ancestor of most bird Pokémon. The shape before flight was fully realized, the wings present but not yet sufficient. Trubbish produces poisonous gases from its body continuously, the output described as strong enough to cause illness with prolonged exposure. Some of its entries note that it gathers with others of its kind in areas where people have left large amounts of garbage, the creature finding a kind of home in what the world has discarded. Elgium arrived in a desert 50 years before its Pokédex entry was written, described as first appearing after reports of a UFO sighting in the same location. Its entries note that its brain is capable of causing terrible headaches by compressing a certain area of the target's brain, and that some researchers associate its arrival with extraterrestrial origins. Litwick burns in a flame that it claims is for lighting the way for those who are lost. The Pokédex notes that the flame is actually draining the life energy of anyone it guides, feeding on the warmth of the person following it as it leads them further from where they intended to go. The light as lure, the guidance as consumption. Golett is a clay Pokémon constructed by an ancient civilization to serve as a protector, the energy within it unknown even to those who study it. The civilizations that made Golett are gone, but Golett continues to function, running on a power source that no current researcher has been able to identify or replicate. Bisharp leads squads of Pawniard, described as the leader of a group that hunts together. It fights a challenger to its leadership every day, the hierarchy maintained through continuous contest. A creature that holds its position through regular demonstration rather than accumulated precedent. Buffalant is described as charging with horns so hard they can split large boulder formations without damage to the Pokémon itself. The impressive afro of fur around its head absorbs the impact of anything that strikes it, the decoration functioning as padding, the appearance and the protection occupying the same space. Rufflet is described as challenging stronger Pokémon to battle, despite the outcome frequently being unfavorable, the instinct to engage overriding the assessment of odds. The Pokédex notes that this courage, even when it leads to defeat, is considered a sign of future strength. Braviary is described as fighting for its friends, regardless of how badly injured it becomes, the commitment to others described as ongoing, even through damage that would cause most creatures to stop. What it carries for others costs it more than the Pokédex describes, in any detached or careful way. Vullaby is a dark and flying type Pokémon that wears a skull as a diaper, described as too small to yet have grown its own proper feathers. The skull it wears is described as coming from a Pokémon it defeated. The first victory worn as the beginning of the armor it will accumulate. Mandibuzz circles above weakened prey from the sky, waiting for the right moment, the patience of the circling described as something it sustains without visible effort. It decorates itself with the bones of its defeats, the collection growing with time. Heatmore breathes fire through a hole in its tail, and its body temperature is described as high enough to melt through the iron armor of Durant, which is its primary prey. The two Pokémon are described as natural enemies, Heatmore and Durant, evolving alongside each other in a long mutual pressure. Durant is described as having a body covered in iron armor, developed specifically to protect against Heatmore's heat. The armor is the answer to a question that Heatmore's fire raised, the evolutionary response, traveling through generations until it arrived at iron. Dano is a dragon and dark-type Pokémon that is blind, navigating by biting things around it to understand them. It bites indiscriminately, the Pokédex noting that anything approaching it should be aware that a bite is more likely than not. The exploration of the world through contact, every new thing understood by being tasted. Larvesta is described as being born from fire, the cocoon it forms at the base of volcanoes, heated by the magma nearby. The evolution from Larvesta to Volcarona requires the most experience points of any non-legendary evolution in the game, the growth measured in accumulated experience rather than in a simple level number. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virishan are the swords of justice, three Pokémon described as having led other Pokémon to safety from human aggression in the ancient past. Their actions established a precedent the Pokédex treats as historical. Three creatures whose behavior toward the vulnerable was consistent enough to be remembered as legend. Tornadus, Thunduris, and Landorus are the forces of nature in the Unova region, described as responsible for the storms that bring both destruction and the fertile soil that destruction leaves behind. Each travels and causes damage, but the damage is part of a cycle that the Pokédex treats as necessary rather than harmful. Reshiram is described as burning with a flame generated from its tail that can cause the atmosphere to heat in surrounding areas, visible as distortion in the air above it. It is the embodiment of truth in the mythology of the Unova region, and whether that truth is comforting or painful, it holds without change. Zekrom is described as generating enough electricity to cause blackouts in large areas, the energy converted from its own rotation. It is the embodiment of ideals in the same mythology, paired with Reshiram in the ancient story of two brothers who split both the dragon they had created and the principles they had shared. Kyurem is described as frozen, the remains of the original dragon that split into Reshiram and Zekrom. The cold it generates is capable of freezing the surrounding area, even in summer. It is the absence left When the separation happened, what remains when the original whole divides, and neither piece carries everything that the whole contained. Keldeo is described as one of the swords of justice, trained by Cobalion, Terrakion, and Varishan in the forests of Unova. It resolves conflict by challenging what challenges it, and the Pokédex describes its horn as becoming more powerful when it is filled with determination to protect something it cares about. Meloetta has a voice described as capable of making flowers bloom and causing those who hear it to alternate between joy and sadness depending on which form Meloetta is in. The aria and pirouette forms are different expressions of the same creature, the music choosing the body rather than the body choosing the music. Genesect is a fossil Pokémon that was found by Team Plasma and modified with technology, a cannon attached to its body, and systems upgraded. The original creature lived 300 million years ago. What it was before the modification is described in some entries as something that the modification has made difficult to recover. Chespin is described as having a harder outer shell that protects its head while remaining otherwise soft, the limitation of the protection clear in where it was placed and where it was not. Its cheerful expression is noted even in entries that describe the shell, the appearance of ease coexisting with the partial protection the shell provides. Fennekin is described as filling its large ears with heat to drive off larger creatures, the temperature inside the ears capable of reaching 200 degrees. It snacks on twigs and branches, drawing energy from the fiber, which sustains the flame it uses for defense. Froakie is described as constantly generating frubbles, a foam that it wraps around its body as protection. The frubbles are described as highly elastic, absorbing impact without breaking. The creature wrapping itself in what it produces, the defense self-generated and self-applied. Bunnelby digs burrows using its large ears like shovels, the ears described as strong enough to cut through thick roots without slowing. The ears that would ordinarily receive sound are used primarily to move earth, the function opposite to what most creatures use similar structures for. Litleo is described as leaving its pride when young to survive alone. The separation coming before the creature is particularly large or capable. The early independence is described as the method through which Litleo gains the strength it needs to return as something larger. Flabébé bonds with a single flower that it picks when young and carries for its entire life, the flower becoming inseparable from the Pokémon's identity. Different Flabébé carry flowers of different colors, and the flower each one chose when young determines the color it will always be associated with. Skiddo is described as allowing children to ride on its back willingly, comfortable with the contact. When it carries a passenger who is feeling sad, it is described as sharing the sadness and becoming visibly affected itself. The emotional transmission running from rider to mount without the mount closing itself off from it. Pancham tries to look intimidating, but is described in every entry as unable to maintain the severe expression, the face softening when it sees something that makes it happy. The effort at ferocity undercut by the instinct toward joy, the two competing in the same face. Esper's ears are described as capable of releasing a psychic blast powerful enough to cause significant damage within 50 meters if not held down. The Pokémon holds its ears pressed flat to its head constantly to prevent the discharge. The danger managed through permanent effort, the control never resting because the force it controls does not rest either. Meowstic in its male form focuses on defense and support abilities, while the female form is oriented toward offense. The gender difference extends beyond appearance to how each uses the psychic power both possess, the same origin expressing differently based on which form it arrived in. Honage is a ghost that possesses a sword, described as having been a sword left in a ruin for many years before a spirit inhabited it. Those who grasp the handle are described as having their life energy drained. The weapon held becomes the thing that holds. Doublade consists of two honage moving together, described as capable of coordinating their attacks through telepathy, the two swords fighting with each other's movements, already accounted for, the pair moving as one while remaining two. Aegislash shifts between a shield form and a blade form, the former used for defense and the latter for offense. The ghost within it is described as having once belonged to royalty, and the Pokédex notes that those it deems worthy find their own ambitions strengthened in its presence, the effect of the Pokémon on the people near it shaping what they pursue. Spritze releases a fragrance from its body that changes based on its diet, the smell produced by what it has consumed. In ancient times, it is described as worn as a perfume because of the fragrance it produced. The creature is accessory, worn for what came off it. Swirlix is described as eating nothing but sweet foods, and as a result, its fur has become covered in a sticky substance that resembles cotton candy, trapping anything that brushes against it. The diet visible in the texture of the surface, what it consumed changing what it became. Inkay defends itself by flashing patterns of light from the luminescent spots on its body, described as capable of causing confusion and disorientation in the observer. It then takes the opportunity created by the confusion to escape, the defense bought by briefly making the world unclear to whatever is watching. Beanicle is described as two separate creatures sharing a rock, pulling in opposite directions on decisions, and described as arguing frequently. The two heads disagree, more than they agree but remain on the same rock, the arrangement maintained despite the friction it produces. Skrelp looks like a piece of rotting kelp, the disguise described as complete enough to fool most creatures in its environment. It sprays a poisonous liquid when threatened, the liquid described as capable of dissolving almost any material it contacts. The appearance of decay containing something actively harmful beneath. Clauncher shoots compressed water from its right claw at such high pressure that it can shatter stone and knock down flying prey. The right claw is described as significantly larger than the left, the asymmetry reflecting the investment in the capability the larger claw carries. Helioptile generates electricity from the sunlight that falls on its neck frills, the frills spreading wide to maximize the surface area exposed to light. It can produce enough energy this way to sustain itself entirely, without eating insufficient sunlight, the frills providing what the world provides freely. Tyrant is described as having jaws capable of crushing a car, and is noted as having been the apex predator of its ancient era. When it does not get what it wants, it throws tantrums described as violent enough to damage the surrounding environment. The power of the ancient predator, expressing through the impatience of an early life stage. Amara is an ice and rock type fossil Pokémon described as living in cold regions in its ancient era and having been preserved in ice until the fossils were recovered. Its Pokédex notes in some games that because the environment it is restored into is warmer than the one it came from, it is described as having a shorter lifespan than it would have had in its original time. The restoration is complete, and the life is real, but the world it returned to is not the world that made it. Hawlucha is described as flying between trees, using its wings, and then attacking with the body weight of a diving strike. Its entries describe it as particularly fond of targeting larger Pokémon, the size of the opponent adding to rather than reducing its enthusiasm for the encounter. Deden is described as able to send electric signals through its tail's antennae and receive signals from others of its kind, the communication happening at a frequency too high for most creatures to detect. It is described as charging from outlets and sleeping in the holes where power flows through walls. Carbink is described as having lived in the depths of the earth for hundreds of millions of years, formed by heat and pressure on the minerals it came from. It radiates a light from the gems on its body that the Pokédex notes is beautiful enough to have been mistaken for stars when seen from a distance underground. Gumi is described as one of the weakest dragon-type Pokémon in the series, its body being mostly liquid and sensitive to drying out. It keeps itself moist by wrapping itself in a slime barrier and seeking damp environments. The fragility of the body and the eventual development into Gudra, which is described as gentle and powerful, come from the same small, soft beginning. Klefki collects keys obsessively, and its entries note that it will not surrender a key once it has added it to its collection. The keys it collects are described in certain games as including important keys that were never returned to their owners, the Klefki unaware of the significance of what it gathered, keeping it for the same reason it kept everything else. Phantump is a ghost possessing a tree stump, described as the spirit of a child who became lost in a forest and did not survive. Its cries are described as resembling those of a child, heard at the edges of deep forests. The description in the Pokédex is direct, and the entries have not softened it across the versions it has appeared in. Pumpkaboo varies in size, and its Pokédex entries note that the size of the individual determines what kind of spirit inhabits it. Larger Pumpkaboos contain the spirits of those whose resentment has kept them from moving on. The smallest ones carry the most peaceful spirits, the size and the weight of what it carries, reflecting each other. Bergmite is described as producing cold air from its body, strong enough to keep the ice it is composed of from melting, even in warm temperatures. Groups of Bergmite attach to the bottom of glaciers, described as repairing the ice that breaks away from the glacier's edge, maintaining what would otherwise reduce. Noibat uses ultrasonic waves of a frequency described as capable of causing large Pokémon to grow disoriented. The waves are produced from its large ears and travel through cave systems, the echoes read as a map of the surrounding space. Navigation through sound in the dark, the cave understood through what comes back from the walls. Xerneas is described as sharing eternal life by illuminating its horns. When it reaches the end of its own life, it is said to release all the life energy it has gathered and transform into a tree, remaining in that form for 1,000 years before waking again. The cycle of giving and resting, the gift requiring the long sleep before the next one. Yveltal is described as spreading wings at the end of its life and absorbing the life energy of all living things in its vicinity before falling into a deep sleep in cocoon form. The life it takes sustains it through the dormancy, and it awakens when the time has passed. The absorption and the return, the loss, and the eventual resumption. Zeegard exists in 5 different forms, depending on how many of its cells have assembled. The complete form assembles only when the ecosystem is under severe threat, the individual cells scattered through the environment, serving as monitors until circumstances require the whole to come together. The fragmented creature becoming something larger only when the situation demands it. Diancie is a carbink that underwent a mutation, described as one of the rarest Pokémon in existence. It can create diamonds from air by compressing the carbon around it, the precious stones produced as a byproduct of what it can do, rather than as something it cultivates. Hoopa is described as being able to summon objects from anywhere by passing them through the rings on its body, items and creatures being pulled from far away, as if the distance between them had been briefly removed. The sealed form of Hoopa is small and mischievous, described as stealing and hiding things. The unbound form is described as so powerful that ancient legends describe it as having defeated 3 legendary Pokémon simultaneously. Volcanion is the only Pokémon in the 6th generation with a fire and water type combination. It expels water heated to high pressure from the holes in its arms, the force described as capable of washing away entire mountains. The 2 types that most directly oppose each other contained in the same creature, the contradiction sustained from the inside. Rowlet rotates its head completely backward to watch for threats without turning its body, the silent flight, and the backward watch together, making it almost impossible to approach without its knowledge. Its feathers are described as functioning as blades, the soft appearance concealing the capability. Litten grooms itself constantly, described as swallowing the fur it collects and then setting it on fire from inside to create fireballs. The behavior is described without editorial comment in the Pokédex, the fire created from what the body generates by being itself. Poplio's balloons are made from a sticky salt water that it blows from its nose. It trains constantly and described as practicing until the balloons are strong and precise enough to be used as tools and as defensive barriers. The training visible in the quality of what the creature produces, improvement measurable in the resilience of the foam. Pikipek is described as hammering trees with its beak at a rate of 16 times per second. The precision described is so high it can carve intricate patterns into wood. The nest it makes is formed through drilling that most other creatures cannot approach in speed or accuracy. Yungoos was introduced to the Alola region from another place and is described as having had a significant effect on the local ecosystem after its arrival. It hunts throughout the day and sleeps wherever it happens to be when night falls, the convenience of resting at the end of wherever movement took it. Grubbin is described as hiding underground in soil and using the string it produces to build complex structures. It is stronger than it appears, the small body containing more capability than the visual suggests, which applies at the larval stage before the capability becomes more legible in later forms. Crabrawler is described as always punching, practicing its strikes on hard surfaces constantly. When it finds a tree bearing coconuts, it competes with other Crabrawler for the top position, the highest fruit as status, and the fight for it as practice. Everything around it becomes either an opponent or a surface to train against. Wishiwashi in its solo form is described as one of the weakest Pokémon in existence. When frightened, the water around it begins to fill with other Wishiwashi that form a swarm, the collective assembling into a form described as capable of frightening even Gyarados. The individual and the assembly are different kinds of power, the transformation between them triggered by need rather than growth. Mariani is described as being feared by Corsola, which it hunts by gripping the branches of Corsola's coral and draining them. The beauty of Mariani's own coral-like appearance, concealing what it does to the coral it approaches. Mudbray is described as having powerful legs capable of carrying loads several times its own weight, the strength developed by carrying heavy earth as it grows. What it carries makes it capable of carrying more, the load building the capacity for load. Dewpider creates a water bubble around its head when it comes onto land, the bubble allowing it to breathe out of water. The water carried with it, the element it came from, worn as the means of survival in the environment it moved into. Fomantis is described as photosynthesizing during the day and resting completely at night, the day's energy stored and used through the inactive hours. The active relationship to light and the complete stillness in its absence, the rhythm regular and absolute. Bounsweet is a Pokémon described as smelling so pleasant that it attracts bird Pokémon despite having no ability to escape them quickly. It spins its calyx rapidly when startled, the spin described as capable of launching it short distances. The charm that draws attention and the limited defense that results from the attention it draws. Comfey collects flowers and attaches them to a ring it carries, described as bringing these to those who are sick or sad. The ring of flowers is always being refreshed, old ones replaced with new ones, the comfort offered continuously and maintained rather than given once. Oranguru lives deep in forests and acts independently, using leaves and other found materials as tools. It is described as issuing commands to other Pokémon, and the Pokédex notes that some of those commands resemble techniques used by human medicine and strategy, the independent Pokémon developing complexity on its own terms. Passimian lives in groups led by a single leader, The team described as training constantly to improve coordination. They pass a berry among themselves during games described as resembling team sports. When one member of the group is sad, the others gather around it, the warmth of the group offered without being asked for. Wimpod is described as so frightened by almost everything that it releases a liquid that sanitizes the area around it as it flees. The byproduct of the fear turns out to be useful, the anxiety producing something clean in its wake. Sandygast is described as a pile of sand possessed by the grudges of fallen beings, with a tunnel in the top that children sometimes reach into, finding themselves pulled into a state where they begin adding sand to the pile without quite knowing why. The small hands drawn in, the pile growing. Pyukumuku is described as being sent back into the ocean by local people who have found them washed ashore, the service provided repeatedly and accepted without acknowledgement by the Pyukumuku. It ejects its internal organs from its mouth as a weapon when threatened, then draws them back in. The Pokédex entry includes this without additional comment. Type: Null was created by researchers attempting to produce an artificial Pokémon capable of taking on the powers of any other Pokémon. The helmet it wears was added because the power it was given destabilized its behavior, the control applied externally because internal regulation was insufficient. The helmet is described as heavy enough to limit its own movement. Silvally is what type Null becomes when it trusts its trainer enough to break the helmet. The restraint no longer necessary when the creature inside it has found something to hold it together from within. Jangmo-o is described as training by bashing its own head against other Jangmo-o and against rocks, each impact strengthening the scale it uses as a shield. The scale that protects it grows more capable through repeated collision, the protection built by being tested. Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini are the guardian deities of the 4 islands of Alola, each one associated with a different island and a different combination of types. They are described as not particularly caring for humans, but willing to help them in certain situations. The relationship described as conditional and not especially warm on the guardian's side. Cosmog is described as a cluster of gas found in the far reaches of space, compressed into a small shape that drifts before it develops into Cosmoem. The Pokédex notes that it is unaware of its surroundings and of being observed, floating in a state of unknowing that changes as it accumulates mass and approaches the transition to what it will become. Cosmoem is described as having been called the cocoon of the stars in ancient texts, a title given by people who observed it but did not fully understand what they were seeing. It weighs 999 grams, more than any creature of similar size by an enormous margin, the density reflecting what it contains. Solgaleo and Lunala are the creatures that emerge from Cosmoem, the sun and moon legendary Pokémon of the Alola region. Solgaleo is described as devouring the light of stars, its body described as a vessel through which multiple suns pass. Lunala is described as absorbing light and converting it into energy that empowers it as the night deepens, the darkness feeding rather than depleting. Nihilego is an ultra beast described as resembling a jellyfish, attaching itself to living things and causing them to become stronger and more aggressive, the host losing more of itself the longer the attachment continues. Buzzwole is described as flexing in celebration after every battle, the power it displays not contained inside the body but expressed outward, the celebration as loud as the victory. Pheromosa moves at high speed, described as capable of running and striking faster than any camera can capture, the movements existing in the interval between frames. The speed is absolute, and the creature is described as finding almost everything in this world repulsive except the fight. Kartana is paper-thin, an ultra beast described as being able to slice through metal with its paper body through movements too quick to follow. The object that seems most fragile is described as one of the most destructive, the assumption of vulnerability reversed by the precision of the edge. Necrozma absorbs light and converts it into laser beams, described as having once shone brightly before an event that left it lightless and angry, hoarding light wherever it can find it. The fused forms with Solgaleo and Lunala restore some of the light it lost, the desperation of the taking connected to what was taken from it long before. Magarna is a mythical Pokémon built 500 years ago by a scientist, containing a soul heart that stores the consciousness of other Pokémon. It was described as able to synchronize with others, feeling what they feel through the soul heart, the made thing that developed the capacity to feel with others, the construction producing something its creator may not have anticipated. Grookey is described as hitting things with its stick out of curiosity rather than aggression, investigating the sounds that result from contact. The stick began as a twig pulled from the hair of its elder and has become the instrument through which it explores. Rillaboom, its final evolution, generates rhythms that encourage plant growth, the music the body makes changing the world it plays in. Scorbunny's feet are described as generating more heat as it moves, the temperature building with speed until the feet reach levels capable of burning what they kick. The creature that warms as it goes, the motion producing the heat enabling what motion alone could not. Sobble is described as crying at the slightest upset, but the tears it produces are described as containing chemicals as potent as 100 onions, causing anyone nearby to burst into tears regardless of their own feelings. The vulnerability as an accidental defense, the sadness spreading whether or not it was meant to. Wooloo lives in groups, described as following their leader wherever it goes. If it falls into a ravine while following, it rolls to the bottom safely due to the cushioning of the fleece. The fleece described is thick enough that even very long falls leave Wooloo uninjured. The softness that protects the creature that follows without always looking ahead. Dreadnought can bite through rock and iron, and the Pokédex describes its jaws as powerful enough to take off a human arm. Trainers who are not experienced are warned that controlling it is difficult because of how quickly the jaws engage. The speed of the bite and the permanence of the result play side by side in the entry. Yamper generates electricity from the base of its tail when it runs, described as a corgi, whose energy for motion is also its primary power source. When something fires into the air near it, it reflexively chases and retrieves it, the herding instinct expressed as collection. Applin lives inside an apple from the moment it hatches, described as hiding inside the fruit and eating from within. The apple conceals it from predators, the shelter and the food being the same object, the hidden life inside something that looks complete from the outside. Silicobra digs tunnels by ingesting sand and compressing it into a nozzle at the tip of its nose, then spraying the compressed sand outward. The tunnel is dug by what the creature takes in and expels, the material of the path being the same material the creature uses to make it. Cramorant swallows Aracuda to eat them, and is frequently shown with one or more protruding from its mouth mid-meal. If it is struck in this state, the Aracuda it swallowed fires out as a counterattack, the meal becoming the defense when the meal is interrupted. Arctovish and Arctozolt are fossil Pokémon created in Pokémon Sword and Shield by combining parts of two different fossils, the resulting creatures described as not well suited to their own designs because the parts were assembled from creatures that did not belong together. The Pokédex entries describe them in terms of functional struggle, the mismatched construction producing creatures that work against their own anatomy. Dracovish cannot breathe in water because the face that needs water is on the lower body and the legs needed to walk on land are on the upper. The Pokédex entry does not editorialize, simply describing what is true about the creature that the assembly created. The same creature that was made from fragments that did not belong together. Phalanx is a Pokémon made of 6 individual creatures that march in formation, the group always in the same arrangement with 1 leader and 5 soldiers. When threatened, they circle into a formation described in the Pokédex as making it nearly impossible to attack any individual from the outside. Stonejourner stands in an open field, alone for most of the year. Once a year, it gathers with others of its kind, and they form a ring together for a brief period before returning to their solitary positions. The gathering is annual and brief, and the Pokédex does not describe what the gathering is for. It simply notes that it happens. Askew is described as protecting its head with a block of ice that it regenerates after each battle. In warm temperatures, the block melts, and its actual head is revealed to be much fluffier and lighter than the ice form suggested. The protection, when removed, leaves something softer than what the protection implied was underneath. Morpeko is described as always hungry, and as it goes without eating, its energy changes the appearance of its body. The face that is cheerful when full becomes something else as hunger deepens. The emotional state tied not to circumstance, but to food, the creature cycling between its forms as it eats and needs and eats again. Coufant carries things using its trunk and is described as capable of lifting 11 tons. Local traditions in some regions are described in its entries as involving Coufant in construction, the strength available and freely used. The creature that joins in what the people around it are doing. Duraludon lives in mountainous areas, described as competing with Tyranitar for territory. Its body is described as very light, relative to its size, the structure achieving strength through geometric arrangement rather than mass. The form that supports itself not through density, but through the way the angles hold each other. Dreepy is a ghostly creature that was resurrected from prehistoric times, smaller than it was in its original form. The Pokédex notes that it wanders aimlessly because it cannot understand the world it woke into, the original environment gone and the current one offering nothing familiar. It sometimes clings to the body of Dragapult, which uses it as a high-velocity projectile from the horns on its head. Zacian holds a sword in its mouth, and its crowned sword form is described as capable of cutting through anything in a single motion, the blade having been refined by centuries of battle, the sword held in the jaw, the Pokémon and the weapon not separable, the fighting and the holding the same action. Zamazenta's shield form covers its body in a golden armor, described as capable of deflecting any attack. Its crowned shield form is described as so powerful that it drove away an invading army by itself in ancient times, the presence of the shield as significant as the presence of the sword carried by its counterpart. Eternatus is described as having arrived from space 50 million years ago, crashing into the Galar region and lying dormant until its energy began affecting the local Pokémon population. The energy it leaked is described as the cause of Dynamaxing, the Pokémon of the region, growing large because of what Eternatus was releasing into the air around them without anyone knowing where it came from. Kubfu is raised through trust, described as requiring the trainer to journey to a specific location and climb a tower of challenge before it will evolve. The evolution depends not on leveling, but on what the trainer was willing to do alongside it, the trust earned rather than accumulated. Calyrex was the king of the Galar region in ancient times, described as holding the capability to see all past and future events simultaneously. The Pokédex notes that it had forgotten most of its powers by the time the games take place, the ability requiring a trust from the people of the region that had faded over time as the people themselves changed. Spectrier is described as running across the lands at night, absorbing the life force of sleeping creatures through its hooves, the sleep as vulnerability, the night passage as silent and one-directional, the creature that moves through sleep, taking what sleep leaves open. Glastrier's mane is frozen solid, and the strength of the ice armor covering its legs is described as extreme enough that its own footsteps leave craters. The cold that the creature generates is not separate from the creature, but expressed in how it moves and what the movement leaves behind. Inamoris is the fourth member of the Forces of Nature group, the only one introduced in the Legends Arceus game, and the only one with a fairy typing. Its presence is associated with the arrival of spring in the region of Hisui, the warmth following wherever it travels, the earth responding to the creature's movement with new growth. Sprigatito is described as releasing a powder from its body that smells pleasant and has a hypnotic effect on those nearby. The scent it produces, without trying, draws attention it has not sought, the passive output of the creature creating a situation around it. Fuecoco absorbs heat from its environment through the scales on its body, the stored heat eventually releasing as fire. It is described as simply walking through the world, absorbing warmth. The fire a product of accumulation rather than generation, the creature receiving and eventually releasing what the world gave it. Quaxley combs its hair into a neat arrangement first thing in the morning, the appearance maintained throughout the day as a form of self-presentation that reflects the creature's sense of its own dignity. Its entries note that it uses a water-repellent coat secreted from its hair to keep everything in order, even in the rain. Palmi is described as rubbing its cheeks with its forepaws to generate electricity, the motion and the organ combining to produce the charge. It has small electrical organs on its forepaws in addition to those on its face, giving it additional ways to generate what it needs. Smoliv stores oil from the fruit that grows on its head, the oil described as extremely bitter and used as a defense by spraying it at threats before fleeing. The fruit it grows provides something, but the something is defensive rather than nourishing, the harvest used to make space rather than to sustain. Lechonk walks around, searching for aromatic grasses and herbs to eat, the diet producing a body odor described as pleasant, despite the creature being classified as a normal type with no particular affiliation with fragrance. The smell comes from what it eats, the external impression a product of what it chose to take in. Tarantula is described as wrapping prey in thread before consuming it, but it is small enough that its Pokédex entries describe the thread as more often used to make complex structures. The builder and the hunter in the same creature at different scales of what it is doing. Wiglet is a water-type Pokémon that resembles Diglett but is unrelated, the convergent evolution producing similar shapes in different environments. Its long neck can be extended or withdrawn quickly, and the creature uses the withdrawal as an escape mechanism when threatened. Finneson creates a ring of bubbles around itself when playful, described as blowing a bubble from its blowhole and then directing it with its fins. The play as a behavior distinct from survival, the bubbles serving no purpose except the enjoyment of producing and moving them. Kilowattrel is described as riding thermals to fly without expending energy, the wings held still and the rising air doing the work of lift. It stores electricity in an air sac that inflates when charged, the storage visible as a change in the body's shape. The charge made legible by what it does to the outline. Maskiff is described as glaring intensely at everything it encounters, the expression so fierce it can cause larger creatures to back away. The Pokédex notes that the intensity is not aggression, but curiosity, the face expressing something different from what is actually inside. The reading of expression as always uncertain, the appearance and the interior separated by more than fur. Shroodle is described as being small, but extremely ill-tempered, marking things it dislikes by drawing on them with its poison-filled claws. The small mark left behind a record of the encounter, the creature's opinion of what it met written in a language only those who understand poison can read. Toadschool and toadscruel resemble tentacool and tentacruel, but are grass and normal types that live on land, a convergent evolution parallel to Wiglet's resemblance to Diglett. The similar shapes on land and in water, the resemblance without relationship, the form arrived at twice through different paths. Bellibolt is described as generating electricity from its navel-like node on its stomach, the orbs on its body that appear to be eyes being decorative rather than functional. The actual eyes of Bellibolt are described as the small shapes on its face that are easy to miss, the creature presented differently from how it actually sees. Cyclizar has lived alongside humans for thousands of years, described as being used for transportation in the same way as a bicycle. The Pokédex notes that it does not mind being ridden. The relationship between Cyclizar and humans described as long enough to have shaped how both have developed over generations. Grievert is described as glowing at night and making sounds to attract people, then absorbing their life force without meaning to. The entries note that it becomes genuinely attached to those who spend time with it, which makes the incidental draining something the creature does not intend, and which creates a quiet difficulty for what it clearly prefers, which is company. Glimmet is described as absorbing nutrients from cave walls and growing mineral crystals from its body as a result. The crystals are described as highly toxic, and the Pokédex warns that even walking through the dust left by Glimmet requires caution. The beauty of the mineral and the danger of the substance occupying the same form. Annihilip is the evolved form of Primeape, the rage that did not stop, the fury that crossed a threshold and brought the creature to a state the Pokédex describes as having surpassed the limits of its physical existence, the Pokémon that became something else because it could not release what it felt. Clodsire is a slow and gentle-looking poison and ground type Pokémon, described as spending much of its time lounging at the bottom of swamps. Despite the relaxed appearance, it uses the poisonous spines on its body to anchor itself in mud and to defend itself when necessary. The stillness as comfort rather than as submission. Farigiraf is the evolution of Girafarig, the two heads now more fully integrated, the tail head having grown to match the front in size and prominence. The two minds sharing a single body more completely than before, the evolution described as having deepened the connection between the two ends of the creature. Dunsparce is the evolution of Dunsparce that many players waited for across multiple generations. When it finally appeared, it arrived with one or two additional body segments, depending on a factor not visible to the player at the time of evolution. The outcome of the evolution uncertain until the animation finished, the creature emerging as either version with no prior indication of which it would be. Gimmighoul is described as hiding in a chest filled with coins, only a small arm visible outside the chest when it moves. The coins it collects and surrounds itself with are described as having been gathered over a very long time. The creature that is barely visible within what it has accumulated. Goldango is the evolution of Gimmighoul, requiring 999 coins before the evolution occurs. Its body is made entirely of coins stacked together, moving in a liquid way despite being solid currency. The number required and the form that results from the gathering are both significant, the patience of the collection producing the creature. Woqian, Qianpao, Tinglu, and Qiyu are the treasures of ruin, four legendary Pokémon described as the manifestations of ancient artifacts that absorbed so much resentment and malice that they became alive. Each one represents a different object, a tablet, a sword, a vessel, a mirror, and each one carries the weight of what was felt toward it over many centuries. Coridon and Miraidon are the box legendaries of Scarlet and Violet, one appearing ancient and organic in design, and one appearing futuristic and mechanical. Both are capable of transforming to serve as transportation, and both are connected to the paradox concept central to the game's story. Creatures that do not belong to the present, but arrived there from somewhere else. Walking Wake, Iron Leaves, Gouging Fire, Raging Bolt, Iron Boulder, and Iron Crown are paradox Pokémon, forms of existing creatures from either the past or the future that arrived in the present through the time distortions of the games. They behave differently from the originals they resemble, their stats and abilities reflecting the era they came from rather than the one they exist in now. Pecharunt is a mythical Pokémon described as binding those it feeds its peach mochi to, the bound creature compelled to do its bidding. It is tiny and cheerful in appearance, the control it exerts not reflected in how it looks, the danger beneath the softness of the presentation. There are more Pokémon now than any single list can hold, without the list becoming a kind of sleep in itself, the facts accumulating the way the games have accumulated across every year, each new creature carrying its own quiet detail, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to find it. This is what the world of Pokémon is, beneath the battles and the catching and the long journeys through routes that always lead somewhere new. It is a world of small truths, waiting in Pokédex entries and beta files and old anime episodes, and long afternoons spent with a Game Boy in the quiet. Each creature holds one fact that belongs to it alone, a detail that says something about what it is, or where it came from, or what the people who made it were thinking when they made it. And if you listened to all of them, all 966 of them, all the facts they carry, you might begin to understand not just the Pokémon, but the long human effort behind them. The designers who drew them, the programmers who coded them, the writers who wrote the entries, the people who made a world out of creatures that did not exist, and then gave those creatures enough detail that they began to feel like they did. The world of Pokémon is very large, and tonight it was very still, moving slowly through every creature, from the first to the last, the facts resting in the quiet between them like something almost asleep, almost at rest, almost done for the night. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.